All right, guys, listen, this is a blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Good evening, everybody. I'm author Douglas A. Burton, and tonight we're going to dive into a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a good long while. It's been growing in my brain, and we have a great panel tonight too. So tonight we're going to discuss what I believe are perhaps the most formative years in pop culture history, where numerous films and stories that came to define Hollywood for nearly half a century first took root. I'm talking about 1975 to 1979, where an entire generation of late baby boomers turned the world upside down with a gritty, confrontational style that accidentally reaffirmed core Western values while launching a sweeping countercultural revolution. Unlike movies from previous eras, which age like time capsules, several films and stories from 1975 to 1979 did the unthinkable. They transcended their era to become culture-defining tales of the human condition. During this span, Stephen King penned classics like Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, and Dead Zone in 5 years. John Williams first composed the musical notes to themes like Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman. Hip-hop first started in the mid-1970s, as did disco, as did heavy metal, as did punk rock. Saturday Night Live first aired on October 11th, 1975, and a small handful of 20-somethings completely captured the comedy industry and transformed late-night television. Take 1977, for example. Between just May and October, nothing less than a seismic cultural shift occurred, all led by a handful of late baby boomers. Outsider George Lucas released Star Wars on May 25th, 1977, to upend the Hollywood studio system. 15 days later, after Star Wars, a 22-year-old Steve Jobs first launched the Apple II personal computer. 2 months after that, a 5-person company called Microsoft saw a new partnership between a 24-year-old Paul Allen and a 22-year-old Bill Gates. A month later, the Atari 2600 hit retail stores, putting video game consoles in homes across America for the first time. 45 days after that, on October 26, 1977, we'd witnessed the final flight of the prototype orbiter known as Space Shuttle Enterprise, just 2 years before the Starship Enterprise first appeared on the big screen with Star Trek: The Motion Picture. That's roughly 200 days for a revolution in film, pop culture, computers, video games, and technology. 200 days. But tonight we're going to focus on pop culture in terms of story and entertainment during those years. I dare say that the films that came out between 1975 and 1979 gave birth to some of the greatest films of all time and set the stage for a 1980s golden age and beyond. I was born in 1976. I'm a member of a latchkey diaspora known as Generation X. In my opinion, the artists and visionaries of my childhood created some of the stories and technology that my generation embraced and celebrated in an unprecedented fashion. We came out by the millions to watch, experience, and share these stories. Together, we built a social and cultural phenomenon passionately creating and sustaining billion-dollar franchises that would span the globe. The special relationship between the late boomers and Generation X is so unique that tonight we're going to talk about it. We'll get into why this happened, what it all meant, and in doing so, we'll pay tribute to one of the greatest periods in entertainment history. Joining me tonight is an absolute all-star panel of guests.
All wings report in.
We have Paulie from the Latino Slant. We have Retro Nerd Girl and the esteemed Robert Meyer-Burnett.
How's it going?
Well, what an intro.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic.
Very nice. Very nice.
I feel like I'm on such an erudite show already.
Well, let's go around the horn, and why don't you introduce yourselves and let people know where they can find you. And if you have any projects or anything you'd like to mention, please feel free to do so. Paulie, let's start with you.
Yeah, just the latinoslant.com. Website is popping. Reviews, news, all kinds of good stuff from mainstream films to U.S. Latino films and Latin America. A majority of the website is in English. Come and check it out. That's what I got every day.
Awesome. Robert?
I'm Robert Meyer-Burnett. You can find me on YouTube at The Burnett Work. I also am a filmmaker. Recently, I produced a feature that is now called Forbidden Tango that was actually blessed by the Pope, by Pope Francis, because of its interfaith dialogue. And I most recently finished an adaptation, an audio drama adaptation of Max Allan Collins's Nathan Heller. The first book in his Nathan Heller series it's called True Noir: The Assassination of Anton Cermak. It's soon to be available in all audio, wherever you get your audio podcasts or audio dramas or books on tape.
Wow. Fantastic. And Retro?
Well, I'm Retro Nerd Girl, and you can find me on YouTube and X. I was born in 1970, and I love movies. So my mission is to serve, preserve, protect, and explore the cultural significance of cinema as a reflection of history, and also inspiring a deeper appreciation and understanding of storytelling and filmmaking.
Right on. And you do a fantastic job with that, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, you know, what's been the reason I wanted to talk about this is, you know, I'm a child of the 80s. I embraced all the pop culture during that period. And as I've gotten older, I've been kind of perplexed to discover that most of my favorite films from the 80s, my favorite franchises, really have roots in the 1970s, the late 70s. And as I've gone back and rewatched a lot of these films from the 70s, I can see the 70s hallmark, which is rather distinctive. Like, for example, if I'm watching Superman 1, I see the hard-boiled 1970s cop stuff in the beginning when they're following Otis, and I'm like, oh my God, there's more 70s here than I ever realized. So as I began to explore it, I really realized there's a center of gravity, an epicenter in the late 70s. And I think we should dig a little deep and explore this period. One of the first things I wanted to say is I've noticed that, and I've discussed this with my father as well, there seems to be a little bit of a difference in the outlook, I would say, from early baby boomers and late baby boomers. And I don't know if you guys have thought this as well, but it seems like the early baby boomers were more of the hippie, the flower child, the proclaimed pacifist stuff. Whereas the late 70s, they were a little bit more gritty, and their films were a little bit more gritty, less experimental, a little bit more like grounded in some realism. Robert, how would you define the difference, or am I seeing that?
Well, I mean, I think what you see starting out in the mid 70s is a result of sort of the destruction of old Hollywood and how it was resurrected by the Mavericks and the up and comers and the rebels of the late 60s into the 70s, because the Hollywood system was dying out in the late 50s and early 60s, because the movies that Hollywood was making they were losing their relevance with people that were now going through the civil rights movement, that were going through the Vietnam War.
Yep.
And there was a lot of cultural upheaval happening. The Summer of Love in 1967 tune in, drop out kind of thing. Timothy Leary, drug experimentation,
Yep.
rock and roll. I mean, was you had Elvis Presley giving way to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and by the end of the 60s, you have Led Zeppelin, and you had Jefferson Airplane, and you had Jimi Hendrix, and I mean, there was a huge, massive cultural shift, and it really wasn't until really the late 60s with movies like Easy Rider. But by the time you get into, and then in the late 60s, you saw things like Kubrick's 2001 came out, Planet of the Apes came out, Easy
Yeah.
Rider came out. You had movies like The Wild Bunch, which turned the Western on its ear.
Mm-hmm.
Foreign films, you were coming off of the French New Wave. Godard's movies like Godard's Breathless, and then Francois Truffaut, and movies like Jules and Jim, and Antonioni's like Ennui trilogy, and there was Japanese films, and the culture was really exploding. You had not just the Beatles, but the entire the first British invasion, and I think things were rapid, and that was coming out of the 1950s, the Leave It to Beaver 1950s, where the greatest generation came home and the middle class was really created here in America
Right.
in the 50s. And so by the time you get into, like, it was really interesting watching Hollywood really start to change. And, the post-Vietnam era of filmmaking, horror films change. You had things like Night of the Living Dead. I mean, Psycho and Peeping Tom came out in the early 60s, but there was a monstrous shift in terms of the kinds of, I mean, if you think about the drive-in movies, exploitation films, things like Last House on the Left, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was 1974. I mean, no one had ever seen anything like that. Romero, doing Night of the Living Dead. And it was really interesting because we were seeing, especially by the mid-70s, there was all different kinds of movies that were being made, but people like Spielberg, he was coming off of Sugarland Express and the TV success he had with movies like Duel, and he went through hell to make Jaws. But you had The Godfather, you had Chinatown, you had Kubrick doing A Clockwork Orange, and then Barry Lyndon. I mean, there were so many really maverick voices, and movies were really changing, and what was being shown to audiences was mind-blowing. And then add to that the books, like you said, you brought up Stephen King and De Palma, famous Carrie, adapted King's first novel, Carrie. And there was all the dystopian 70s sci-fi that was coming out, and the future
Right.
shock stuff. I mean, it was really a crazy time. And then also television, in 1977, in January of 77, Roots, the adaptation of Alex Haley's Roots came out, and no one had ever seen slavery depicted on national television the way it was depicted in that miniseries. And
Yeah, the viewership was incredible.
it was every American watched it, and I think was shocked into realizing, one of the great pockmarks on American history, which was, of course, the slave trade. And that was happening, and that was on national TV. And you had like I, Claudius airing on PBS, and there was all kinds of, I mean, what was really interesting was it was transgressive, and it was exciting, and there were so many different kinds of movies being made. I mean, on one hand, you had big budget movies like Warren Beatty's Heaven Can Wait, or Bob
Love that
Fosse's All That Jazz, which I loved. And then, of course,
All
you had the
That
big blockbusters. You had not just The Godfather, but you had The Exorcist, which was an adaptation of William Peter Blatty's novel, which, again, no one had seen anything like that before.
Yeah,
And then,
a
of course,
commercial blowout. It was a total commercial success.
yeah, and people were seeing things like, they're like, you can't show us that. Well, I guess you can. And then it became a big hit. So it was, and also these were also very, I mean, there was always lowbrow cinema, but for the most part, audiences were interested in embracing smart, intelligent adult fare. The escapism of Star Wars was an outlier. I mean, you had everything from Bonnie and Clyde, like we said earlier, Godfather, Chinatown, The Exorcist, but even movies like Network, which was an incredible
Yes.
Yes.
satire of Network, written by Patty Chayefsky. You had paranoid 70s conspiracy thrillers like The Parallax View,
Oh, yes.
Alan Pakula's The Parallax View. And because in the post-Vietnam Watergate era, we were losing our trust in the government. And of course, that was an adjunct when you had Martin Luther King and the two Kennedy boys assassinated. Who knew what was going on? We were on the Cold War was ratcheting it up. Man, it was crazy times.
Yeah. So as a Generation Xer, when I go back and watch some of the early 70s films, like you said, they're very serious. There's not a lot of humor in them. They're hard boiled and somber, and the tone is very serious. So when you say that Star Wars is an outlier, I think I know what you mean, because Star Wars is not like that. Star Wars is like fun and swashbuckling and adventuresome and a little silly at times and humorous, and then good versus evil was clearly defined. It's like you said, it's not as wrapped up or as grounded in reality as some of those other 70s films were. And then I think you also mentioned several films that had kind of an experimental feel to them. When I go back and watch a lot of the films from the 60s, for example, I'm like, man, they're really testing a lot of things out. And even like when I think of like Dark Star, that came out in 74. That was like a student production that made it. Yeah. O'Bannon, that made it all the way to the big screen. So it seemed like a very atypical period of time. And it seemed like by the time we get to the late 70s, there had been a little bit of a settling and a little bit of a new world view kind of taking focus. That's what it seems like, at least when I look back at some of these earlier films.
Yes, I'd like to say, for sure there is that demarcation. I would say Jaws is like the one that kind of like was the one that really kind of became that summer blockbuster hit, that it was like, oh, everybody can go to see this movie at least like 20 times if they want, the whole family. And that changed the amount of money that studios were able to make. I mean, the lines, I remember actually going to the theater to see Jaws.
Yeah.
And I remember the lines. I remember, how big of a deal it was. Whereas some other movies, definitely before then, not a big deal to go see. This was an event that was a cultural event, actually.
Mhm.
And so there was like this effort, seems like from studios, to continue that effort. If I'm not mistaken, there were a lot of changes in studio heads at that point in time as well. It was just like the sort of fluffing off the old and bringing in new leaders to kind of refresh this machine, because they were getting they had all these musicals, right? Musicals and westerns were kind of like dominating like the 50s, 60s, and even so, a lot of the 70s had still held on to westerns. There were a lot of really great westerns, but then the musical just kind of faded a bit, as where they were so much very, very, very important before. So that was the big hit of its day, but it was starting to change. And maybe the effects of having to go through so much Vietnam War, 20 years of their lives for the boomers. I mean, it was a big chunk of their lives. And then with the civil rights, in the 60s, and just trying to change things, it felt like that was something that they were interested in. A lot of the movies were really forward thinking, looking towards the future. It seemed like there was more hope, I would say, after the
Well, I was talking to my dad about this, and he said one of the big differences between, let's say, your early boomer, let's say hippie, versus the later, he said the draft was the draft changed things. You're not theoretically against a war in Southeast Asia. You're getting drafted and you're going.
And friends of yours were going too.
Yeah.
And friends are going too. And you don't know if you're coming back. You don't want to go. Then you had draft dodging. I mean, he said the draft changed things. The draft started, I believe, in 1969 and went to 1972. Vietnam War was technically over by 1973, at least for the United States. And so suddenly there's this like, it's over. It's over. And that's when just being an observer from that's when I started to see kind of a different tone creeping into the cultural zeitgeist. And let's not forget too, Jaws is widely credited as pretty much inventing the summer blockbuster.
Yes.
There was some hype for 1970 Godfather 1972. There was a lot of hype for The Exorcist 1973, and then 1975 Jaws. You get this blowout thing. It was I don't remember because I wasn't born until 76. I've had to only get my information from documentaries, so I think you guys would be better to talk about it. But it seems like the ubiquity of this Jaws symbol, the shark coming up and the girl swimming,
so good.
it was everywhere, apparently.
Yeah, it was, and I always saw Jaws. There was another thing that I didn't touch on, which was the disaster movie.
Yes.
You had the Poseidon Adventure, you had Earthquake, you had Airport, and there were these things that a cruise ship suddenly would be turned over by a tidal wave. An earthquake would come and destroy our urban environments. Airplane travel was no longer safe. It was, and then there was the Nature Strikes Back movies. So Jaws was both a Nature Strikes Back film and it was a disaster movie in a way because, this shark is desecrating the American holiday of the 4th of July. You yell barracuda.
How
people say,
dare
huh?
that shark?
What? You yell shark and you've got a panic on your hands on the 4th of July.
Well, and you know what? Watching Jaws, it occurred to me probably years ago now, but there's such a commentary between Quint and Richard Dreyfuss. I feel like Quint represents the greatest generation. He's the hands-on, don't tell me, maybe not college educated. He went out, he's the roll up your sleeves type, and then you've got Richard Dreyfuss, who represents, a baby boomer. And these two quibble, and you see the two world views playing out on the Orca. Quint wants to go out, he wants to do it the old school way. And you've got Richard Dreyfuss coming in with all this technology and all these ideas. So you have cultural dialogue going on in Jaws, with Brody being kind of like the mediator, the uninvolved, the neutral party who ends up having to get more involved as the story goes on. But that culture commentary is in that film. Even though it's a disaster movie, you have two different generational worldviews looking at how to tackle this disaster, this shark apocalypse that they're in.
Well, you're out, and he was also a survivor of, the USS Indianapolis. He was a World War II veteran. When they were in the wake of delivering the atomic bomb, he tells the story about what it was like to survive.
One of the greatest monologues ever.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah, but you're right. And then Hooper comes along as, he's not only that, but he's like this entitled rich kid. He comes from a wealthy family. He's got his newfangled boat and all of his sonar equipment. And whereas Quint's like you pointed out, I'm old school, man. I got a harpoon. I'm basically Captain Ahab.
Here's to swimming with bow-legged women.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. You have the whole generational, and that the conflict between Hooper and Quint was what was happening on the streets of America.
Yes.
You had these people come back and create the middle class after surviving World War II, and people thought, that could have been the end of the world. And then it ends, and then you have the Cold War, which really could have been the end of the world, where you're living under the cloud of nuclear apocalypse. And what does all of this mean? And then when you saw what was happening, like how come great leaders like Martin Luther King were taken out by powerful forces that we didn't necessarily understand.
Faceless, yeah.
And suddenly our leaders that we used to believe in because they won the war, now the military, and Eisenhower warns about the military industrial complex when he leaves office. And now you're seeing, we had questionable things like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and why are we involved in Southeast Asia? And suddenly our youth doesn't trust anybody, never trust anyone over 30.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
It was
slogan.
It was a fascinating time.
Well, think about it, right? From 75 to 79, like everything that you guys just said going into it, and from the streets, and those characters representing different different people in our society, our American society, is that the punk aesthetic was really showing up everywhere. Even in our big films, even with some of the some of the crazy leaps that some of the producers made, took. I was also thinking of Bad News Bears. I believe came out 75 or 76. That was highly influential to me. Yes, because they did have two little Mexican fat kids on the
But it was also transgressive because the way the kids talk.
It was so transgressive. Let me tell you, R&B, I got in trouble because I spoke like Tanner on the beach with all my tias. And it was like the first time I dared to curse in front of my family. Oh boy, I got spanked. I'm like,
You went for it.
Tanner, man.
Bad News Bears 76, by the way, 1976.
But it's a thread, right? Even De Laurentiis in White Buffalo. What the hell was that? That was just so bonkers. Ending in 79, then too with Superman 2 and or Superman, making Superman and Rocky 2. Man, I saw all these films at the theater.
Well, there seemed to be a growing appetite, like you mentioned earlier, Robert. The Leave It to Beaver, the squeaky clean black and white America, and this move away from that to a more and more like visceral, gritty, downer stuff, even but then Saturday Night Live comes out the same year as Jaws, so this idea of irreverence in comedy, I would say, exploded there with Saturday Night Live.
But see, that's where I'm going back to 76 was one of the first performances of help me out here, in Manchester, England.
The Sex Pistols.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. You brought up, Paulie, the punk aesthetic. I mean, you had things like movies like Taxi Driver, which weren't necessarily openly punk, but there was definitely a punk. I mean, to the point where he shaves a mohawk into his head at the end, and so and again that fighting against authority and destroying the what was built up post World War II is now being torn down. And it was you had National Lampoon and Saturday Night Live and Animal House came out in 1978, and before that you had John Landis making Kentucky Fried Movie. And then you even had in the wake of The Exorcist, there was all these religious themed horror movies where religion was no longer, it was certainly irreverent, but like that punk aesthetic, the music
aesthetic.
But the funny thing too is that also disco, we got disco and we got the joyful sort of, let's just do a lot of blow and dance. First I was afraid, I was petrified, whatever. And it's
Saturday Night Fever could be even a punk rock aesthetic take on the disco era.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, that's one of the greatest films. Also,
it was dance as protest in a way, right? You're breaking conventions, which is a common theme. Dirty Dancing does it in the 80s, but
Danny Trevino, was it Danny? What was the character's name? Help me out here.
I will say Danny Zuko, but that's
Danny Zuko.
Yeah.
No,
he's totally breaking from his Italian family, from everything.
Yeah, I mean, disco dancing was his way of. That's how he was somebody. That's how he got away from his. He was the star of the dance floor. And
I mean, it was and it was funny because at the end of that film, it was already a fad. Right.
Well, and but that sound, I mean, what was really interesting, if you think about it, like George Lucas in the early 70s made American Graffiti, and that soundtrack was all of those late 50s, early 60s songs.
Yes.
But by the time you get to the 70s, I mean, you had really interesting things like Ken Russell made his version of The Who's Tommy, which was a crazy acid trip musical. You had Quadrophenia, which is I don't want to be a punk anymore. I want to be a rude boy like my dad. You had that. You had Saturday Night Fever. I mean, and what was really interesting
Tony Manero. Thank you.
Tony Manero. That's right. Tony Manero. there were all these different subcultures that we're suddenly seeing on screen as well.
That's
And not
right.
only that,
Yeah.
add that blaxploitation movies.
Yes.
You know, you had people like I just watched Three the Hard Way with
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
Jims. I love this movie, man. Jim Brown, Jim Kelly, and Fred Williamson, directed by Gordon Parks, who made Superfly. But I just got that. That was another thing. And then you had even the James Bond movies were kind of old hat. And so in 77, they decided to go full on fantasy extravaganza with Spy
Yeah.
Love Me and the
Live and Let
Underwater
Die.
City.
Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was even the Bond movie. So Live and Let Die is a blaxploitation movie, and A Mouthful and Gun is a martial arts film,
Yes.
because
Yes.
those were two other genres that were being co-opted by the Bond franchise in searching for relevance because the Playboy era of the early 60s, where Bond came from, was kind of old hat by 73, 74.
Mhm.
Well,
And
you know,
then we had
Enter the Dragon in
that's what I was
1973,
just
another
gonna say. Yeah.
yeah, another subculture. You know,
Yeah.
the kung fu films coming out there.
But
It just
see,
feels like a real like melting pot now of movies. We're talking about scaling like Asian, African American. It just seems like everything was just actually coming together and forming this new kind of media, which I love.
yeah, but I go back to the whole kind of like independent, the punk aesthetic just creeping in on everything, because everything was just such a reactionary, like even our heroes wouldn't be considered the heroes of our parents' age,
No.
like a Luke Skywalker or Rocky Balboa. I mean, these guys were,
Right.
were punks. These guys were outcasts. Han Solo. Uh, yeah, it was a great.
He doesn't
a
believe
great
in
era.
hokey religions.
It was a great era, and I would even say, there was a film called Boulevard Nights that came out in '79 with starring Danny De La Paz, which really was the first kind of studio film that documented Latino life and lowriders. Really kind of ahead of its time, but it was the same thing. It was the same thing with when anytime you're documenting the subculture, where it was like it was so out of what do you call Leave It to Beaver.
Right.
You're in the same city, just a different hood.
Yeah, no, and that's another thing you had. It wasn't just movies, but music, popular music, and films were melding. And Saturday Night
yeah.
Fever's soundtrack became this gigantic.
Huge.
It soundtracked the whole. But before that, you had like Isaac Hayes' theme to Shaft.
Yes.
Became so Shaft as a piece of that music became a cultural force, even though it came out of a movie. It was a cultural force unto itself.
Right. Well,
that song.
Some of those Bee Gees, like "Staying Alive," I mean, that has transcended the era.
Oh, yeah.
You will see this emerging in film. Like my son wanted to watch Ready Player One the other day, and I was like, "Oh yeah, let's watch Ready Player One." I like that. There's "Staying Alive." It was one of the songs in there, so I was, it's like part of the era, but it's also universalized somehow, which seems to have happened a lot around this time. That these songs, these films, these stories, these books, they're part of the 70s, but they've kind of broke out of the box, and they kept on going somehow.
They're pop culture legend, They've become part of like the universal soundtrack of our lives.
Yeah, they keep going there. Like my kids know these. They're Gen Alpha. They know some of these songs already. Even just looking at Saturday Night Live, Jim Henson was involved. This guy creates the Muppets.
Yes.
Fraggle Rock, Yoda. I mean, Jim Henson, Dark Crystal. Jim Henson became a force unto himself just with puppets, just with the art form of puppetry.
Well, we had Sesame Street and the Electric Company too, and so when we were kids, I mean, in terms of educating us, and then also, I constantly been talking about this lately, but we had Schoolhouse Rock as well, where you had, on Saturday morning television, there was literally, we were getting educated with catchy songs and animation that were teaching us about politics and history and grammar and mathematics and science. I mean, and this was
I'm just
this,
a bill.
yeah,
Just a
absolutely.
Yep.
You know, and we unpacked our adjectives. He was a hairy bear. He was a scary bear. You know, and
And
all
then
that.
let's add to that, right? Sid and Marty Croft.
Oh yeah, stuff like Lidsville, which was a kids show for people who wanted to get high. I mean, however that. I mean, there was, and then stuff like Land of the Lost and H.R. Puffin stuff, and I
Dr.
mean,
Shrinker.
yeah, he's a madman with an evil mind.
That was what I was. It was a truly incredible time. Then you had the Wonder Woman, the Incredible Hulk,
Linda
Bill
Carter, Lou
Bixby.
Ferrigno. Yeah,
Um,
1975. Arnold Schwarzenegger wins Mr. Olympia, and then in 1977, him and Lou Ferrigno are in a documentary called Pumping Iron.
Pumping Iron.
And you know, that's it's amazing to me as a Gen Xer to realize that Arnold Schwarzenegger really had, you know, he's a baby boomer. Like, you don't think about that necessarily, right? But he's a baby boomer, and he had this whole other life just in the world of bodybuilding in the late 60s and in the 70s. And then he became kind of shifted over to film a little bit later. So to me, I always think of him as that 80s action hero, but he had an entire life in the 70s, way before Hollywood, just as this charismatic bodybuilder. You know, that's beginning right now in this era. And Lou Ferrigno goes on to play the Hulk, like you said, Paulie. And so you had, you know, before Mark Ruffalo, you have, you know, Lou Ferrigno. Before Gal Gadot, there's Linda Carter. And I would argue that both of those two portrayals are iconic. They are still considered, just like Christopher Reeve, those are still considered almost like the mold. You know, this is the original. This is how you do it right. Everything else is a spinoff of these, you know.
Well, another thing too is that the creation of all of this stuff, it cost a lot less to make movies and entertainment. So there was a lot. I mean, everybody wanted to make money, but mostly it was driven by creatives that wanted to create this crazy, nutty stuff that they were getting the money to make because it didn't cost $100 million.
Right.
So a lot of it was driven by artists that were trying to do something purely creative. I mean, can you imagine going to a studio and pitching a movie like Taxi Driver today? No one would let you make that movie.
They don't even understand what your angle is.
No, and
that movie's now considered inappropriate, and you know,
every
you need a
you
need a warning on that movie today.
Yeah, and it was like we had a much more our culture. I think our culture today has been, while people know a lot more, I think we have been infantilized. I mean, when you're coming off of the civil rights era and you're coming off of the Vietnam War and the things that we were being shocked by the imagery that are in, you know, in Texas Chainsaw or Exorcist, or even to a certain extent Jaws. We were seeing things that were very transgressive. And the violence in movies like in Taxi Driver, or what we saw, even the head in the corpse's head in a bed in The Godfather. That kind of violence was never portrayed on film before. And the rape revenge movies that were being made, and there was all kinds of stuff, like whether it's Last House on the Left or Thriller or Cruel Picture, and there was so many things that even, you know, Night of the Living Dead and the sequel Dawn of the Dead, which came out in 79, there was things that we'd never seen before, and we were grappling with once you've had our leaders assassinated, and once you've had Dr. King killed, and you saw what happened during the civil rights movement. Activists were murdered, you know, in the Deep South, and we had television to bring us body bags coming home during the Vietnam War. I mean, our culture was being shocked in addition to being galvanized by our pop culture. It was a crazy, I mean, I was alive during that time, but I was younger and I wasn't aware of just what you could see in a day. You know, the things that you were exposed to. You could have disco music playing on the radio. You could watch body bags on the news. You would hear about all this horrible the Watergate break-in, and our president was corrupt and he had to resign. Then you had the space program. We were landing on the moon.
I was just going to say, you know, I watched that documentary Apollo 11 just a week ago. And there's one scene, it's all original footage. And there's one scene of a camera in a hotel lobby It's a bunch of people from 1969 smoking cigarettes with their 5-cent coffee in a hotel lobby, and the TV's on and they're playing the news. And I just couldn't believe what was on the news cycle. They're like, in other news, Vietnam's heating up. This happened in Vietnam and we're doing that. I'm like, oh man. And they're talking about casualties in Vietnam. Then the next story is Senator Ted Kennedy is still hiding, still in his compound from Chappaquiddick. And, and then the next story is, and the space astronauts are on their way to the moon. I was like, that's the news cycle on that Tuesday? Give me a break.
I mean,
I want to go that all being said, that was always in the background, but I want to go back to what Rob said in regards to this generation now, as far as like, access to information. But the kids aren't going out and playing and getting in trouble like we used to.
No.
Oh yeah.
Like, all that we said, right, man? We will, we had our action figures, army guys. We would burn them, we magnify them, we'd have fun, we were on skateboards, we were, hopping on rooftops we shouldn't have been allowed to.
Through rooftops.
Yeah, man. It's like that was kind of like one of the last generations to grow up like that.
Kids would break their bones.
Yeah.
So many kids I went to elementary school with had casts on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was
I mean, it was like nowadays, when was the last time you heard of a kid breaking his leg if they're not skiing or something? But just I was practicing my Evel Knievel jumps and I fell off my bike.
So I have two kids. The difference is their friends are out with them all the time. They go on to play Fortnite. I'm not kidding. There is a rolling 11 kid number. There's always 11 of their friends, roughly. That's my arbitrary number. Either on Fortnite, on Roblox, whatever. But they don't need to go out because all they have to do is put on their headphones and turn on whatever electronic device they want, tablet, TV, video game, PlayStation. And there's at least 11 kids just sitting there for the. So, you have, as a parent, you have to like get them to go out. And then when they go out, they're like, hey, can we call this guy? Can we get my friends to come out? Because I don't understand what are we doing here just standing by ourselves?
I lived in a very diverse West LA growing up at that time, 75 to 79. I mean, blacks, Asians, Mexicans, Jews, and I mean, literally living on the same block. And we lived in a cul-de-sac. So man, the boys we were always just hanging out and there.
I lived on a street with a cul-de-sac too, and we were always like, I remember when Rollerball, the science fiction movie with James Caan, the original Rollerball, when it aired on TV, we all went and got our motocross bikes and skateboards and roller skates, and there was one mailbox in the cul-de-sac that we would use as the goal because we saw it in the movie. Yeah. We would play Rollerball and like beat on each other. Kids were starting to get hurt, but it was kind of cool because it was like, yeah, we're playing rollerball. I mean, it would.
Well, and by the way, rollerball, 1975. We're right there again.
Yeah, but that was.
We would do the same thing.
We were out,
and we would do the same thing with Bruce Lee films because a lot of them would be reshown during the late 70s.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Everybody was doing that.
We were just learning our own kung fu karate stuff. We were just
choreographing it.
But you know what was,
man?
I think the real difference is what you were just explaining. Nowadays, when you have the thing about having, whether it's Fortnite, whether it's Minecraft, whether it's Roblox, whatever, these are a structure and a thing that's already set up for you. So like when you turn on a game and you got your friends playing the game, we had to figure out what game we were going to play.
Right.
We had to invent the game.
And then like we'd have to, if we wanted to go play baseball, you'd have to get enough people for 2 teams.
But see, okay, so let's go back to movies, right? R&B, like going to a movie was an adventure with our friends.
Yep.
You
had to get there.
Right. Yeah. I'm taking the number 8 bus at this time. I'll see you there or at this stop. Or it was the same thing with us. We're going to the beach. It was a great time, man. It really was.
It was. And, thinking about what you were saying a second ago, Robert, about how many things you could see in a day and, the kind of things that were happening, assassinations and the awareness of nuclear winter as a possibility on any given day. The word I've used to describe what I feel is there's a difference between, let's say, just in filmmaking, between the filmmakers of the past, the storytellers of the past, the literary writers and minds of let's say the 50s. sobriety. There was a certain soberness to like, oh, okay, I know what's possible. I know that there's real danger in the world. I know I have to tread carefully, and I'm going to try to find a way to smile. I'm going to try to find a way to laugh. I'm going to try to find a way to experience life in a fulfilling way. There seemed to be a soberness and also a desire to live life still. And I feel like we've lost the sobriety. People are like, there's no consequence. You know, you could do this, you could do that. I'm like, whoa. Whoa.
There's
like,
all, you know what, though? There was also, I think there was also a sense, flawed though it may be, there was certainly a sense of right and wrong.
Yeah.
Like
absolutely.
we as kids, there was a morality that we would face. And we knew if you were going to shoplift, that was a bad thing to do. We'd try it, but we knew that it was bad. And I think that there was, and another thing, there was an innocence
I love it.
that has been totally removed, I think, from the modern age, because kids, you know, the greatest thing in life when you're like 10 or 11 or 12 would be to kiss a girl, you know, and that would be the most amazing thing. And so when that would happen, it was truly magical, you know, and we didn't have internet pornography. We hadn't seen any of that. And if you
but
could
there
find
were Playboys.
if you could find, but those are just naked girls. There was no sexual acts. I mean, later Hustler and
Did
things.
you say just naked girls?
Well, but I mean, but we didn't know. Like, I didn't have a sense of sex itself. You know,
Yeah.
I just knew I wanted to kiss a girl and, you know, hug her and kiss her and smell her hair, whatever. That was it. And then it would progress sort of naturally.
Right.
You know, there was a natural, and both the girl you're with clearly wanted the same thing you did, but you're both trying to navigate how you're going to get around all that.
Yeah, without embarrassing yourself too much.
There was a sweetness and an innocence to all of that, you know, and all of that has been completely swept away. Like, on one hand, our civilization today has been infantilized, but at the same time, girls are, instead of getting a job at the mall, you're going to get an OnlyFans account. And that's really weird.
Yeah,
like,
age 18 and make like 6 figures.
Yeah.
You know, well, I've noticed something too about just in terms of storytelling for the modern generation, similar to what you're talking about. There's like fragments of all sorts of pop culture. There's fragments of history, fragments of all this stuff. It's everywhere. You know, I think of like in Willy Wonka with all that stuff floating over the top and in the TV room. It's just everywhere, right? So, for example, my kids really got into Squid Game. They bought the Legos. They bought game sets. They talked to their friends about it. They memorized never saw a minute of the show. Never saw a minute of the show, but they knew all about it. They knew plot points. They got the ideas. They knew characters' names. They knew who 456 was. They knew all of it, but they never saw the show. And it dawned on me. I was like, wow, without having seen the show, the show has been diced up, thrown out on TikTok in a million different little sound bites, and they absorb it and they get the basic idea. So when dad comes around, I'm like, hey, not that I would say let's watch Squid Game, but if I'm like, hey, let's watch Star Wars, like, oh yeah, the one where his dad is the robot, but they get it. They've heard it all before. They can watch a Legos cartoon or a Legos movie and find out that Darth Vader's Luke's father now. And it's like, oh man, it's like, how can I even present these stories if if a million little things have beat me to it? You know?
Well, like, and everything's had The Simpsons has done a parody of everything, you know. So people grew up with people were making, whether it's South Park, whether it's Simpsons, whether it's, you know, SpongeBob SquarePants, all of these things that we had as cultural touchstones have now been parodied, and they've been sent up, and they've been turned into comedy bits. But I think that the thing that's really that has totally changed is because of the rise of the internet and social media, everything now comes to kids. We had to go out and get it. Like, we had to go out and have adventures, and we had to get on our bikes. We had to call our friends. And like you were saying, Douglas, we had to figure out, well, what are we going to do? Are we just going to stand around? And somebody had to, like, and what was really interesting was we learned how to politic with one another. It's like, okay, you want to play baseball, but you want to go to the beach. What are we going to do? We have to decide. And we wouldn't spend hours trying to figure it out. We'd make
Gotta
our
figure it out
decision in
now.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, let's go to, okay, we'll go to the beach. We'll play baseball tomorrow. And we would learn how to negotiate with one another, you know, and because we don't want to stand around. We want to go do something.
And
So
also too, yeah, adding to that, it's like you would also always run into, you know, the older kids or bad kids.
Yes.
And as a group, you're like, yo, you know, we know not to mess with these guys, or we know how to say hello and then move along. You know, there's no way we could even do that nowadays.
No, and
Well,
it's funny that you say that, because there were some bad kids that were into some bad stuff, you know,
they were roving.
and you wanted to stay away from that. But sometimes you'd have interactions with the bad kids. Sometimes it would go badly for you. Sometimes it wouldn't go so badly. But
Yeah,
you
if they were in a
learned how
good mood.
yeah, but you learned how to live in that world where the specter of that, and you learned without parents telling you, you learned how to negotiate your way around these obstacles, which helped everybody grow up. You were
Right.
learning through
100%.
experience.
Right.
100%. And
Right. And so, you know, bringing it back to film. So we talked about how, you know, there was a sobriety, a groundedness to a lot of these films. Part of the thing that I wanted to also explore is why some of these films from this particular time popped out and went to define the 80s, for example, the exact childhood that we're talking about, and why they've kind of gone on to the 90s and into the 2000s, and even survived long enough to be chopped up into a million pieces onto TikTok for Gen Alpha and Gen Z. You know, it's weird how much these things from this particular period of time seem to survive this process, whereas that wasn't so common before this.
I do have
Yeah.
to yeah, I have some ideas about that. When you look at these films, not only are they, you know, outliers, you know, they just had a way, especially if we look at Jaws, because you couldn't just see the first Jaws and not see the second one and the third one, whether you like the, you know, the franchise. It was one of those things you wanted more, and you remembered the quotes. You remembered the quotes. They were iconic lines. You never forget, you know, the things that are being said. And so you never forget that last dance in Saturday Night Fever, and you never forget the trench run. And these are things that stick to you. The stories also stick with you. It's not just like the next, you know, new story. These were different. These just had a way of being so iconic, well written, and hit you in a place where you right inside, you know.
Well,
Especially
you
if you
know,
were young, you were an impressionable kid, you will never stop talking about what you felt like the day you saw Jaws. You'll never stop talking about it.
well, in Star Wars, you know, I was watching A New Hope. This is now every time I watch A New Hope, I can't help it but see this now. We were talking earlier. I mentioned the intergenerational clashing between like Quint and Hooper and Jaws, right? You have the greatest generation, the baby boomers. You know, they didn't get along. I apparently on set, they didn't get along in the film. You know, when I watched the Battle of Yavin at the end of Star Wars, I noticed something. You know, so Vietnam ended. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there are generational factors that are baked in, I believe, to these films. So when I watched the Battle of Yavin, I noticed that when Luke comes to the rebel base there at the end, he's in with a bunch of pilots who are older. They're an older generation.
Yes.
And Gold Leader, he even has a little bit of a draw. He talks, you know, a little bit like that World War II generation. They're the older guys. And Luke and Biggs, they're the young guy. And Wedge, they're the young guys. They're clearly adolescent. They're clearly the little guys in this battle. So when you're watching the Battle of Yavin take place, the older guys are leading this attack. You know, get set up for your trench run. You know, go. You know, this is Gold Group. We're going in now. You know, and these guys get picked off one at a time.
Yes.
The only guys that are left even Gold Leader goes down. Boom! Luke sees him, looks out his window. It's one of the only ones that Luke is really looking at and observing. Gold Leader's dead. The older generation has been removed from the battlefield in the Battle of Yavin. It's just these young guys It's the baby boomers. It's
Yeah.
Biggs. And what does he say? We're going to change it up. We're going to go in full throttle. We're going to do this different. We've got our own idea. And even Wedge is like, Luke, are you going to be able to pull out in time? He's like, dude, this is like how I grew up. This is how I played, right? This is what I did. I've done this before. I can do this here. So the young guys go in and they take down the Death Star, their generation. And when I think about it, I'm like, these are the guys that were called baby killers and people were spitting at them and they, quote, lost Vietnam. They lost the war. But in Star Wars, they come through. They destroy the Death Star. And it's not just that they destroy. There's a ceremony and everyone is standing there and they're honored with medals by the princess herself. So I was like, that must have felt good to have observed that back then. You won. You won the war. You beat the bad guys. And the bad guys were obvious and clear. So when I watch the Battle of Yavin now, I see sort of this intergenerational play, this intergenerational thing at play, even in Star Wars.
It's interesting when you say that because I just watched, it might have been an older interview with James Cameron and George Lucas, and George mentioned that he said that the rebels were the Viet Cong.
I heard that.
He actually, which I thought, I was like, oh, interesting. That a lot of people were against this war, but he saw himself as the Viet Cong, or saw the protagonist in the situation. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even James Cameron fashioned the colonial Marines and aliens later after Vietnam soldiers.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
wow.
back to your thing about Star Wars, I think there was definitely, like you pointed out, a generational shift. Even Vader, your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes or provided us with the location of the rebel base, and you're the last of your kind left in the galaxy. And Luke's like, in the briefing, the guy, one of his compatriots is like, that's impossible even for a computer. And it's Luke who's like, nah, I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters. I mean, and it's Luke who's got that can-do attitude, and like, we don't have to follow the rules. We can make this work.
Luke, you switched off your targeting computer.
Yeah, what's wrong? And all of that stuff was definitely at play. I mean, you look at Ben Kenobi, he's the grizzled veteran of foreign wars guy,
Yes.
and when everyone's like, oh, that old man's just a crazy old wizard, he's basically just a homeless dude, and we saw veterans of Vietnam fall into homelessness and addiction and all kinds of stuff. And
terrible.
and it's definitely there, and also the generational divide is something Lucas dealt with in both THX 1138 and in American Graffiti.
Yes.
In American Graffiti, it's all like, this is our last night of basically our innocence, our childhoods, and then you're going to go off to Vietnam and we're going to go to college and I'm stuck in this town and what's going to happen, and that whole thing. And I, it's funny. I look at, there's all this talk nowadays about kids suffering from incredible anxiety, and lots of kids are medicated today. And I look at that and I'm like, what anxiety? The anxiety is all this stuff because you're worried that someone's going to dox you on TikTok or whatever, or that you're not going to get likes, and it's weird because everything is flipped. Kids have everything coming into them. Like when we were younger, when I was growing up, I didn't spend much time thinking about myself. I didn't think about like my identity. I thought about my friends. I thought about going places. I thought about doing stuff. I wanted to go out and see this movie or go get this record or experience this. I didn't have any anxiety. And the things, I suppose maybe we probably should have, considering what we were doing. Like if you'd have anxiety if you ran into older kids, Like,
Well, and
like
we
what's
would get
gonna
into fights. We
you
actually
w-
got into
we
fights.
yeah, we would get into fights, and it's such a weird thing
Oh,
when I see.
yeah, really fast. It wouldn't be fights. You just get your ass kicked. That's why the anxiety.
Well, yeah,
So
but I mean,
true.
but the thing is now, can you
Mm.
imagine your parents would run to school on, I'm going to sue you for that. I mean, now
Right.
it's like
No.
we had the last thing in the world you wanted was your parents to step in.
Yeah,
Like
Yeah,
if
no
you
way.
had
no.
some beef at school and your mom or dad found out, that was like the worst.
You
Yeah,
would
you don't want
you'll
them
get it even
interviewed.
worse the next
Terrible,
week, yeah.
it would just be embarrassing that you would even run home and tell your mom that somebody beat you up.
Yeah, you did
Yeah.
not
Yep.
tell your parents when you got into
No.
fights and trouble. I remember one
No.
time I got into a fight and I hated the kid and he kind of got the best of me and then my dad suddenly comes outside and everyone clears and everything. He's like, "What's going on?" I was like, "God, I didn't want to tell on him." Like you said, the last thing I would do is snitch on this guy. And then so I was like, I fell. I just hurt myself on the fence. And my dad's like, "All right, you're grounded." He goes, "I've been watching you guys through the window this whole time." So the fact that I was getting in trouble for lying, for not telling on the kid who I was fighting 2 seconds ago. So yeah, it is very different. You were expected to handle your business on some level.
Yeah.
You were expected to be somewhat self-reliant. And I think I mentioned I called myself a part of the latchkey diaspora. I was a latchkey kid.
Me
My
too.
parents did not come home until 6:30.
Yeah.
So I did whatever I wanted. And so there was a level of self-reliance. And with that comes this idea that your problems are your problems. They're not something you need to bring mom and dad in on. And what's crazy, my parents were fine with that. They weren't trying to like invade my space and figure every little thing out. They let me deal with these problems in a large part. And so yeah, when I look at today and I'm like, man, what is it that everyone's so like bent out? Like, I have kids in baseball. This guy's getting thrown out of a kid's baseball game for yelling balls and strikes because his son's up to bat and he didn't like the umpire. Guy's getting thrown out. And I was like, dude, like, get out of the way. Let your kid play baseball, man.
Yeah, it's bizarre. Like it's a weird, like parents were always, that was the nuclear option. If you had to bring your parents were like weapons of mass destruction, that was the last thing that you'd want to
That's true. Yes.
you'd want to do. But another thing was that we were allowed to fail. Like we were allowed to try things and mess up, and that's how we learned. Like I my girlfriend's two daughters, I've basically watched them grow up over the last 10 years, and a lot of the time they're so terrified about doing something wrong. They're always like, well, what? They're always asking like, well, how do I do this? I don't think I ever asked anyone how to do anything. You like if the chain broke on my bike, because we rode our bikes everywhere, I'd have to figure out, like, I'd go ask, I'd be like, hey, the chain broke. Where can I go buy a chain? Or where can I go do this? And you would go out and do it. Like you had to do it yourself. And if you needed your father's help, you would ask your father for help. You would go to your dad and go, Dad, I need help. You wouldn't expect him to fix your problem for you.
Correct.
You'd have to, and your father would help, but it was up to you to go ask. It's not it, and I think
and
that
dad always expected you to be the driving force behind that solution. He wasn't going to do it all for you. He would come in and adjust a few things, but my dad was very in and out. He wasn't going to camp out and help me for a long time.
And your father, like my dad, I use the bike example because I remember it really did happen to me. And I didn't even have the money, but I didn't have the money to buy a chain, but it was a legitimate thing. My dad said, you know what, we'll go get a new chain for your bike. And then he sat there and made me put the chain on.
Right.
And was pointing out, like, here's how to do this. Like, and it was nice for him to spend the money to buy a chain, because I had an allowance and I had a paper route and made my own money, but I didn't go ask my parents did not give me money. They didn't. You were expected to make your own money, or if you got an allowance, save it up or whatever. But in the case of a broken chain, my father, when we went to the bike shop and bought a new chain, but he showed me, he said, look, this is how you oil the chain. It's not hard to but it's a skill that he knew that I might need, especially if you had a 10-speed bike or something. Your chain could come off when you're shifting gears, and you were being taught skills. Like when I first drove, my dad taught me how to change a tire. I'm 16 years old. My dad's like, okay, I'm going to show you how to change a tire. You're going to have to do this now that you're driving. And he made sure that I knew how to change a tire. He goes, it's something you need to know. You shouldn't get behind the wheel of a car unless you know how to change a tire. And it's something that when I first moved to LA, I had a blowout on the 405 and I had to change my tire on the 405 with cars whizzing by, man. And it was not easy, but I was like, I was able to do it in like 5 minutes. And my friends I was with were like, how'd you do that? I'm like,
well, and you said like, you said you were allowed to fail. You're allowed to fail. There was a value placed on failure, not as in like the end all be all, but we all knew there was a belief, a trust in that process that there's going to be trials and errors. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fail. I was even thinking like Rocky, the movie Rocky from 1976. He loses the battle.
Yes.
It was a Best Picture winner, by the way. It's the film that really launched Sylvester Stallone. In the entire film, he's going up against, he's a nobody, right? He's a nobody, and he's going up against it seems apparent to me. I'm sure someone has verified this, but like a Muhammad Ali take, Apollo Creed he's loud, he's mouthy, he's the best, he's the greatest, and Rocky's going to fight this guy, and when you watch Rocky, you think he's going to win, and then he doesn't win. The victory isn't that he wins the fight. The victory is that he goes the distance, and think of the message in that, and by the way, Rocky launched the sports underdog genre.
Yeah.
And Rocky would go on to become an 80s franchise,
But he won the girl, man.
Yeah, he won the girl, yes.
He won the girl, and he won his dignity, and he was just he was an absolute nobody at the beginning of the film.
Well, it's a beautifully written script. My God,
everyone disregarded him. I mean, it's an incredible. And then you see that the script is so well written, and Adrian is the one who believes in him.
Yeah,
they're so connected. It's almost, you can almost say it's a very unconventional love story.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, but Rocky gives me something, right? It's not just a movie. It's not just about boxing. In real life, there have been times, and I've even thought about Luke in Empire Strikes Back, where he's hanging upside down on the weather. The hero comes back, right? There's times in your life where things aren't going well. You're down, and you're like, man, I don't know if there's any coming back from the end. But I had these movies. I'm like, Rocky lost, and it wasn't about the fight. Maybe it's about something else. Maybe there was something that I did here, even though I failed in this one situation. Maybe there's something else for me. So these movies still modeled something for me. It wasn't just a character. It was a character that modeled how do you take a loss? How do you go the distance? How do you keep your chin up when you go the distance against an undefeatable guy like Apollo Creed? What do you do when, you're dismembered and you're hanging upside down with no hope of a, these characters give you some of that. So to me, I think these movies, as far as the fine tuning of the morality or the incidental messaging that ends up in these films, there's a strong sense of being allowed to fail and learning from it. In fact, Retro, you and I have talked about why some of these great, strong women on the big screen these days, like Ray, why they're failing. Because they don't fail. They're not given a chance to go through this ringer. They're kind of, it's the bad guys that keep losing. And pretty soon you're like, I'm kind of pulling for the bad guys because they're the ones who have some growth. They're the ones who are Kylo Ren's going to learn something out of all this eventually. So
it seems like they want to give and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it seems like they want to give, a lot of female characters the hero's journey, but a story line, but they're missing a lot of the innards of that, which is like, okay, the hero in the hero's journey, the hero does fail and comes back from the nether region to become the hero. I mean, you have to go through that. I mean, I'm sure like in life that's exactly what occurs as you begin to learn how to do things. You have to fail first, and then you learn. You figure out exactly how to do the things that you want to do. So,
well, even one of my big heroes growing up was Superman. Superman came out in 1978, and he's kind of the opposite of Rocky, right? He's got a different problem. And I've analyzed this as a writer. I've really thought about this. There's the Rocky type of hero who's got nothing, and has to come up. And I oddly, I got this thought watching Secretariat, the racing horse, who won in 1973, actually.
Yeah.
It's like a perfect horse, this perfect horse. And you listen to the horse people all around Secretariat, and they're like, well, it could break a leg. There's all these things that could happen to these high pedigree horses. And I'm like, wow, there's a challenge to the burden of this idea of perfection, which Superman has. You're the perfect specimen. You can't lose. And so what do you do as a writer? What does this character do? The character immediately starts to fail. Even the ones that aren't, even the horse that's never supposed to lose, even the superhero that's never, that is faster than a speeding bullet, they have to fail. And, there's something too, when you watch Superman, when he finds Lois Lane and her car is buried in rubble, and he's got no answer for this at first.
He's lost everything that he cared about.
Yeah. Right.
And he lost her because he made a promise to Miss Tessmacher, because she makes him, he has an impossible choice, because Lex knew that he probably couldn't stop 2 nuclear missiles going in the opposite direction.
Correct.
So Miss Tessmacher's like, you got to go, you have to save my mom in Hackensack first. And because he's a man of his word, he's bound by that covenant, and he has to do that.
But think about even that scene. Think about even that. And I'll just say this real quick. Even that scene, Superman is the weak character. Miss Tessmacher is not. Superman has kryptonite around his neck. He's barely floating in a pool, and it's this like bimbo hot chick, and she's hot. Like when I watch Superman, I'm like, man, Miss Tessmacher, wow. But it's Miss Tessmacher that has to save Superman. So Superman doesn't get a free pass all the time, and like you said, not only does she use the opportunity to negotiate with him, she also steals a kiss from him.
Yes.
And he's like, why did you kiss me? She's like, I didn't think you would let me later.
No, exactly.
I was thinking about these films of that era, guys, and their legacy, and how some have still a great legacy. I know me and R&B are fans of the Creed movies. You think of Rocky's influence out into different cultures. I mean, a lot of African Americans love Rocky so much. Coogler and his dad would watch them together, and that's the whole thing of how Coogler tried to pitch it to Stallone. I think that's amazing. It's unfortunate that Star Wars hasn't had that love and care. And I was listening to R&B the other day talking about just like the rested state that Star Wars has been as far as the animated side of it, whereas Andor, it's finally got to grow up a little bit. But think just how influenced the Rocky, Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman. Because we're on the eve now, guys, of the new Superman coming out. I mean, these are still huge characters to us. Now, I hate saying IPs and content. I mean, I hate that.
I do too.
These are huge. These are heroes. These are heroes to us still. That was the thing. These are our heroes.
Well, and there's something about Superman too that, like, he's like unapologetically a good guy, right? Truth, justice, the American way. I remember when I was a kid, I remember I was a little guy. I mean, I'll never forget. My dad would tuck this little red cape or this red towel in my shirt. He'd fly me around and then throw me on the bed, and he'd be blasting on an LP the Superman soundtrack by John Williams. So even to this day, I'm 49. When I hear the Superman music, it crawls back into my psyche to some primal part of my existence that just remembers this music as this is what a superhero is like. And, in life, as I got older, I struggled because I was like, man, it's not so easy being like the good guy. I remember sometimes you'd be like, put that back. Don't do this again. And people are like, dude, I'll kick your ass. Like, get out of my way. You're like, man, how do you walk that path? How do you be the good guy? So but Superman was still an ideal for me. You know, he was still an ideal. He stood up to those guys. You know, he stood up to Lex Luthor and the bad guys. And you hope that you can be like that yourself, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
And
there's a lot of fantasy in that, like seeing someone take out the bad guys, something you wish you could do. You know, I wish I could stand up to people like that and get, get some justice. But there's still like a feeling of like, okay, we've got to figure out our own like way of dealing with that in real life.
right.
But it's so nice to see these movies and get get that that fantasy of like, yeah, Superman's gonna turn back time and get to his lady. That's just so amazing.
But
I have to share a story real quick about Superman. I was just recently watching an interview with Terrence Stamp, and I was listening to it just because I happened to have watched Superman recently. So I was like, oh, there's Terrence Stamp talking about Superman. Coincidentally, it's not the internet listening. So Terrence Stamp is talking, and he's like, yeah, it was a small role to play General Zod. And he's like, I agreed to it. And he was talking about it being very, it's only a handful of lines, in the story. And apparently he didn't know too much about it. And it's like, yeah, you're going to do the scene and you're talking to Superman's father and all that. And like the day before filming, he's like, who's playing Superman's father? And they're like, Marlon Brando. He's like, Marlon Brando? I'm going to be in a scene with Marlon Brando. And I didn't understand this now, I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now. Brando was really more of a 50s actor, and this was kind of a little bit of his comeback to Godfather was really a gamble to bring him back.
Yes.
So he was coming into Superman, and Terrence Stamp, they're like, what was it like to work with Brando? He's like, so for my bit part with Brando, he's like, it was weird watching him work. So I guess Brando, when he was practicing the lines, he would be like, you disgust me. Like the way his method, I'm disgusted by, like he was trying to capture this idea of being disgusted by General Zod. And I guess his plan was, so when he stood there and stared at Zod in the tribunal, that's what was emanating, like the stoic expression of disgust. Anyway, I just thought it was really cool because I think he did an incredible job playing Jor-El. What a treat that is, right? Superman's dad is Marlon Brando.
Well, first of all, when I saw him on the screen when I was a little girl, I was like, "Who is? Oh my God, that face looks so familiar. Who is this man? He looks so good." So I loved it. He was fantastic, and he's not even in there for a few minutes, and he really like captured the spirit of that character so well and
think
set the
about
standard.
Yeah, think about that character too from his character standpoint. Jor-El, he has an opinion. He has a belief. He has an understanding that Krypton is actually on its last legs. And when I was watching Superman recently, I was like, man, this guy is awfully cool-headed about. They're like, you will not cause a panic, and he's like, I give you my word. Neither I or my wife will leave Krypton, and he calls it Krypton.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. He almost plays it like he's going to the grocery store, and it's an apocalypse on his planet, and he sends his son off into the void. And so again, here's another character who takes the L. Takes the L. Jor-El.
With stoicism, right?
Yeah.
You know what? It's funny that we talk. Obviously, Superman's been on the internet's mind as well because the new James Gunn movie coming out. One of the things that I found particularly interesting as a phenomenon, as far as fandom is concerned, is the rise of the Snyder Bros. And the fact that I have been the things people have said to me over a Superman movie. Like I liked Man of Steel. I like Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, but the problem that I have with the film and his, like, Snyder is depicting superheroes. It's rather one note. He's making them all the gods of Olympus, and I do like that's a lot of fun. But what they don't have is, like, I go to Superman the movie, the scene where Superman is being interviewed by Lois Lane on her rooftop is such a great scene because Superman knows what effect he has on people. Superman's kind of a baller. He knows, and when he's interviewing, it's like this back and forth. He's being cutesy with her. Like he knows that women are attracted to him. He gets it. He's been in the Fortress of Solitude for 12 years, learning the 28 known galaxies, all the information he needs to know. So he's like a fully realized human being. And when Lois goes, "What color are my underwear?" And he's like, "Well, I can't see through lead." And she's like, "Well, that's interesting." And then as soon as she gets up and walks away, he goes, "Pink."
Pink.
And it's a callback because he's having fun with it. They're flirting.
Yeah.
Like Superman is flirting with Lois Lane. Lois Lane, "Do you eat?" Yes, when I'm hungry, I eat. And there's the whole.
That's great.
There's so much more humanity and adult behavior. And like when I said that was a great scene, somebody came at me going, "That's just Superman's being a creeper," and I'm like,
A creeper.
Yeah, because like he's looking at her underwear with she has given him permission to look at her underwear. And in the 70s, it was people are a little bit more, pervasive. It wasn't. And I realized that the thing about Superman in Superman the movie, the way Christopher Reeve portrays him, is he's both a god and a man.
Yes.
And when you see the opening of that movie, the whole first 30 minutes after you leave Krypton, the scene, that shot where the camera swings around after Pa Kent's dead and you see the wheat field and the big sweeping great score. I mean, it's unbelievable. I get chills just thinking about it now.
Me too. Yep.
There's so much more human emotion in that Superman movie than there is, because the Superman, Zack Snyder's Superman, is a construct. There's not a lot of humanity in that. Now I understand that a lot of
disagree.
no, but you don't have there's very few scenes where Superman's being a normal, like having a normal conversation with people. He doesn't even get to the Daily Planet till the very end of the movie. So he's seeking, like, who am I? But you don't have a scene where, and like when he sits down with Lois Lane, he's incarcerated, and it stands for hope. And there's stuff, and you've got the relationship with Jor-El, but it's clearly a science fiction movie, and you're not dealing with like the scene when Superman first breaks out in the original movie, when he does all those things. He gets the cat burglar, he saves Air Force One, he gets the cat, you see him interacting with humanity, on a number of levels where he can't find a phone booth to change in.
Oh, that's great.
And he walks out, and you got like the pimp and his hose is like,
"Man,
Jim, that's a bad outfit," and then he takes off, and the pimp just, "Whoa," And I mean, you see all of this stuff happening, like the mugger when Superman grabs the bullet, and she's like, you shouldn't smoke those, Miss Lane. "Well, I know, cancer, right?" And he uses his X-ray vision and say, "Well, not now."
Not yet.
Yeah.
Thankfully, not yet. And so he's interacting on a very human level, whereas the Superman of the Zack Snyder verse is very much a god, and which is cool. That's a cool depiction. That's why I liked Man of Steel for that reason. And there are great moments. Like I love the scene when he's a kid. "My son saw what Clark did," and when he pushes the bus out of the water. But even that is when he's a kid in Smallville in the original movie, he says to his father, "Every time I get the football, I could score a touchdown." So he's never able to manifest his powers. He can't be seen. Whereas the Zack Snyder's movie gets away with it. They're like, he can manifest his powers. We're going to let him do that. We're going to let him save those kids. And it's a different thing. But I think there's people that are attracted to the godlike, because that in their minds, they like that godlike Superman, because kids today aren't as used to interacting with other kids or other people in the real world. Well, the Superman in 1978 was much more of a real down-to-earth person, as opposed to the depiction in the.
I have actually studied things that a big thing, I'll just narrow it down. But one of the things you could do I refer to it as destabilizing a story is to deify a character, because if the character becomes less and less relatable. It doesn't mean you can't do it. There are films that do it and make it work. You have to restabilize your story, but when you deify a character, you can destabilize it. And one of the things that Mario Puzo, Godfather writer, who wrote the script to Superman in 1978, one of the things he did was humanize him. And I thought that was brilliant because he kept the story stable for us. So by the time Superman's fixing, he's going to fix the the engine goes out in an airplane and all those pilots are in there and he's like, just fly. We love all that.
Just fly.
Don't look. We like that because that's how we would react if we saw something like that. We're still amazed by this. It's still out of the ordinary for us. And that's what makes it work. And even that scene you talked about in the cornfield, that emulated a phase in American history where a lot of college-educated people left rural America to go to the colleges to get educated into urban environments. And there's something about that scene that I love. And I don't even know why. I should probably figure out why. But she goes, "Where are you going?" He just says, "North." It's such a nothing answer, but it's a direction. It's still an answer.
Well,
so anyway,
it's also like, if you look at some of the things, like their choices, you could, in Superman 2, Superman goes and takes his revenge on the guy that beat him up when he was powerless. But one of the things that really always bothered me about Man of Steel is when Superman, the bully in the bar that Superman's working at.
Oh, I love that scene.
He goes and he tears the guy's semi truck up, and he's like hanging it, he hung it in a tree, and I'm like, that always bothered me because Superman, I don't think, would do that. He would, it's like when he threw the guy in the pinball machine in Superman 2, and he just goes, "I've been working out,"
Yeah.
and whereas what he did to that bully, that was a thing to do, man. That was in a way, there was a pettiness to doing that I don't think Superman has. And I understand it was a great joke and it looked great, but I was like, I don't think he would do that. And you're seeing the same guy who's being selfless on the oil rig, which is a great scene when he saves the
right
oil workers.
Well, because I like what you're saying, where you're getting at, because it's they're moral lessons.
Yes.
Code of conduct, how to behave.
And
like,
Superman would have figured out a way to teach him a lesson without destroying a vehicle that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Well,
it's kind of showy. You're right.
Well, to me, it just lets me know, and I'll just give you some background. I absolutely love that movie, Man of Steel, and I did not expect to. I didn't expect
right.
to. I was avoiding it for a long time, and to this day, I really haven't seen a Superman movie that I didn't like, which is really weird. It's like a weird thing. It's like there are a lot of people who don't like, any of the later Superman movies in the 80s, but for some reason that character just, like, even though he changes in each movie almost, there's something about that character. And so I kind of got used to the idea that all of the Supermans in all the different iterations were just going to be different.
Sure.
So for me, the psychology of what was built in Man of Steel for Superman worked because of his upbringing with his dad,
Sure.
which is also unconventional. I remember a lot of discourse about that. But there, as far as, what is the Superman, that I often go to as like my soul calls to, it's always 1978. I grew up with that movie.
Yeah.
And there is just something about the innocence of Superman in that movie that I really feels identify with the child and still inside of me.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. And
Yeah.
to say what the thing about Man of Steel, I've always thought of Man of Steel more as a science fiction movie than a superhero movie, because so much of it, you have the big setup on Krypton. You understand there's a codex and the entire Kryptonian, and and they just arrive on Earth. I mean, it coincides with Superman finding out who he is, but there's never a time when Superman's just dealing with everyday life for a while. You know, he's been Superman for like a week, and the Kryptonians show up, and suddenly he's having to fight for
Yeah, that happens rather fast. Yeah.
the world. So there's not the moment where Superman gets to like reveal himself to the world and like
Mhm.
rescue Air Force One and rescue a cat in a tree, and there are all those things that are kind of fun
Mhm.
that you smile like there's it's whereas in that movie immediately you have these aliens that want to kill everybody. You know, they
Yeah.
want to destroy the earth and
An immediate
turn it
threat.
into Krypton, and it's this dire threat, and you don't get those moments where like Miss Tessmacher taking away the kryptonite and kissing him, like you said. I mean, they didn't have to put that in the movie, but it's so great that they did, you know, because every woman would want to kiss Superman, not just Miss Tessmacher.
Yeah,
Yes.
And
Superman's
Well,
like
one of the best scenes is definitely, the date scene where he takes Lois flying. It's so
oh,
magical.
it's magic.
So
Yes.
magical, that scene, and we know, like, okay, they're on strings. We know that, the background behind, but it's still with the music and everything,
the
it's
music is
just
incredible.
so
Yeah.
lovely. And I believe I saw it, more recently and was taken aback by, exactly how magical that was for a low tech. This is
Right.
it's a low tech movie, in the late '70s. Great stuff.
Yeah, they achieved some levels of intimacy with the
Yeah.
superhero. You know, you have to conceive of that as the writer and the filmmaker. You have to be, how do we do something intimate with a superhero and make it believable? How do we sell this
Right.
to the late
Yeah.
'70s crowd? And they did. I thought they did an incredible job with the romantic themes in the first Superman.
It had never been really done. I mean, this movie really set the standard for Superman. I know that there were TV shows, and I saw
George
some.
Reeves.
There was a animated TV show as well, which was really fun, and corny and at the same time. But this was setting the stage for Superman. And I don't expect every movie to follow suit, but I thought the idea was that the Steel Man of Steel 2, which never got the chance to, really come to fruition, was gonna cover all of that, like, down to earth, human stuff that people were craving from, Man of Steel. So I it's almost like, yeah, a lot of people were definitely and still are, like, wanting that, even though things turned out differently. But, with the new movie coming out, I hope they land the plane and they do deliver that kind of stuff, that human element. Um,
I am cautiously optimistic about it. The only thing that makes me nervous actually about the new Superman coming out is the number of characters that I
there's
see
a
in just
lot, yeah.
the trailer. So now it might not be a factor. It could actually end up being a great thing. So Robert, I think we were talking about this right before. You got to wait to see the movie
You have
before you
to
really
wait.
pass judgment. You know, it's
Yeah. I
it's
mean,
one thing to judge a trailer, but I wouldn't hang a hat on that. You got to go see the movie at the end of the day.
yeah, and I think though that like if you go and an indicator like the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, there's the core group of characters, but there's a lot of other external characters like Glenn Close running Xandar and
Oh, true.
there's all these people that they don't have a lot of screen time, but it's a fully fleshed out universe. And I would imagine that Superman is going to focus on Superman. And yeah, we've seen the Justice Gang or whatever, Maxwell Lord. I don't think those characters are going to be at the core of that film. I think they're going to set up the idea that this is a universe that is full of superpowered beings,
Mm.
and
And then put them kind of, like, more towards the end, the last third.
yeah, or they're just there, and it's what ends up happening is there's a certain, I would imagine, immorality or to the society, and what the society, that's when everybody's super no one's super,
Yeah.
and no one is acting the way. Like, it's one thing to be super powered, but who's super heroic? You know, and
Yeah, who
I
acts
don't know anything about the movie, and I mean
right.
super heroic that somebody who has a moral center and somebody that is driven by the fact that maybe Superman's more of a Dudley Do-Right character in this world, and that's what makes him unique. And suddenly he has to rise to the occasion, and I think James Gunn gets that. I think he's really going to bring us something special. Like I really do.
Like I said, I have some. I'm more cautious, not so much about James Gunn or what I saw from the trailer. Just you get this sense that Superman has to they have to pull this one off because superheroes have been kind of striking out a lot. However, I'll say James Gunn, he did some pretty amazing things with Guardians of the Galaxy. You have to remember, no one knew what the heck that was when it came
Nope.
out. It was a raccoon and a big bodybuilder alien. Like, this should not have worked. I remember even SNL did a skit on it. They made fun of it because, in a good way, in a positive way. They're like, Marvel's next film, and they showed the Guardians of the Galaxy coming around the corner from the trailer, and then they're like, then the next film, and it was someone just shoving a shopping cart down the hallway, like, that's the new movie. He has done a good job of striking a right balance between humor and story. And we have to remember that Guardians of the Galaxy 3 came out when everything else was failing, and that one didn't. Even Guardians of the
Right.
was kind of a serious one. Even my kids cried because of the torture of the animals and stuff.
Yep.
But that one succeeded. That one made money. So Guardians of the Galaxy 3, he nailed it on all three of them. And I actually love Guardians too. I'm a big fan of Guardians of the Galaxy too. So I think it's going to be good. And I think he may have found. Everyone's worried about crypto. I think crypto might be the little missing piece that can change the dynamic here and make it a little bit more lighthearted and fun. I know my kids they love crypto in that trailer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to the movie a great deal. I mean, I think that if nothing else, we're going to get the kind of I think we're going to get a superhero movie that we haven't seen either before or haven't seen in a long time.
I think it's going to be I think it's going to be good, and I think it's going to make a lot of money. And I think Superman might be that breath of fresh air that we've been needing. It's not. I doubt it's going to be a preachy type of superhero movie. I've got a good feeling about it, and I'm a Superman guy. Like, I think Retro, you and I sound like we're on the same page. Like, we grew up, and Superman was one of those characters that we just loved. So I am rooting for Superman. He has cultural relevance, cultural power, and this could be a return to form for at least this character. I don't believe in superhero fatigue. I think when you write bad stories, it's not fatigue. They just get turned off by the bad writing.
I agree.
So, but I just we're running out of time. So I wanted to get to 1979. So just to recap some of the stories we've been talking about, the films, which started in the 70s, even though we might associate these franchises with the 1980s and beyond. We've had Rocky, Jaws, Star Wars, Superman. I think those are the ones we talked about. Animal House. We should probably talk briefly about Halloween. John Carpenter's Halloween, which also came in 1978. John Carpenter, what a force unto himself. I have really come to appreciate this man's work as I've gotten older. I've always liked it, but I've really started to love it.
Huge fan.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And the cultural significance of Halloween itself, that franchise is insane. That people are still, wanting, they're like, please give us another Halloween movie. And it's like, they've done everything,
Well, it's funny because both Carpenter's Halloween and then George Romero's Dawn of the Dead also came out in 79. And if you think about Dawn of the Dead, The Walking Dead wouldn't exist without Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead. And so both, Carpenter's Halloween and the whole slasher genre, of which, I mean, there was movies like Black Christmas before Halloween, but Halloween was really the the one that solidified the slasher genre. And then, of course, after Halloween, you had Friday the 13th, and
Friday the 13th.
you know,
Yeah.
and everything from April Fool's
Texas
Day
Chainsaw Massacre was 74.
yeah, but the slasher, that slasher movie with the babysitters, and then the virginal girl that is the final girl that survives
Final
because
girl
she
trope.
hasn't transgressed and all that. And another movie that also came out in 79 was Alien.
Oh,
Alien,
yeah.
You know, and
Yes.
we're still getting these things even now, you know, almost 50 years later.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
amazing. The same group, the same generation comes in, and you know now they. And what's funny is when you really read into Alien, it originated from Dark Star, which was a comedy, and it was a low,
Yes.
but it's so goofy when you watch it. I'm like, wait, what? But you know, that movie made it to the big screen. Say what you. But also you had Dan O'Bannon working on this thing, and you know he went to France for a little bit. They were going to do Dune and that misfire with Dune. You know they were going to cast Mick Jagger as Fade Rauta.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's weird that they
I would
stuck
watch
with the
that. I
rock
would watch
star.
the heck out of that
Oh
movie.
my God. So anyway, so you've got this group again, and a lot of these guys are USC film school guys
Yeah.
who keep crossing paths. And here they put together Alien in 1979, which has gone on to become one of the most beloved sci-fi horror, like Alien and Aliens, which came out in 1986. Are two of the greatest films ever. And what's phenomenal to me is how they both are two different genres. They're really two different genres, and they're both incredible. I think Retro, you and I have talked about that at length, but also Ridley Scott headed Alien. So you had an experienced filmmaker from the UK heading this. And man, talk about a film that transcends the genre. You could see the 70s fingerprints.
Yes.
But when I watch Alien, it looks like they could have made it yesterday.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
so
Yeah,
good. It
yeah.
really holds up.
Yeah. And then,
Absolutely. Yeah,
there
absolutely
maybe a
holds
few
up.
moments.
and
Yeah,
then
I
there was
think with the costuming, there's a couple of moments there, but and the editing too, which is a really big part of a lot of these movies. The editing is definitely part of the reason why they look so good. It's just perfectly done to set up all of that rich tension and keep you on your toes, even if you've seen it a million times. Every time we get to that end scene, it's just like, my eyes just pop out, and I just have to, say, "Hush, everybody, let's just watch this."
Well,
no, and the thing about what I thought was really interesting about Alien is you've got a bunch of workaday people.
yes,
These are blue collar oil rig workers,
totally.
and they're all good at their jobs. I mean, they might rib one another, but they can fix things. I mean, that giant refinery, you know, Yaphet Kotto and John Hurt, they're going to fix everything, you know, or Harry Dean Stanton. They'll fix it
Right.
all, and they're good at their jobs. But then they end up being faced with this extraterrestrial threat that they're not equipped to deal with, but they're not stupid. You
Right.
know, they're getting picked off, but they don't even know what they're up against. And what they're up against is way beyond their ability to control it. But you like all those people.
Yes.
All of them.
You know, no one is cannon fodder. Everyone, they all kind of endear themselves to the audience. And what's great is the smartest person on the ship really is Ripley. You know, she says, "We're not letting you in. There's the quarantine." And then of course Ash opens the door anyway, you know, but it's like everybody's smart. And there's that great scene where Ripley goes to talk to Dallas and like, do you trust Ash? And he's like, yeah, because they don't know, you know. And it's a very, very smart movie that's beautifully directed, unbelievably well shot. Again, a creepy Goldsmith score, incredible effects, and it set a tone. There's never been another movie. I mean, Aliens is a war movie. You know, it's a jarhead, totally different kind.
Yeah.
But what Alien did, I mean, there's been movies that try like Event Horizon and stuff like that, but they're not as Alien is simple, but it's so well done. It's so smart. And again, it came out of that 70s naturalism where the characters 70s movies made you believe that these people were real people. That was something that's really hard to do now. Everything is archetypes and shortcuts and let's make all these perfect people, whatever, you know, whereas in Alien, no, you part of the appeal is that you buy it. These are just normal people faced with an extraordinary
Yeah.
situation.
They're space truckers, right?
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, truckers in space. Well, like in Prometheus, you just get a sense that they're starting to like, it's like personalities on steroids. Whereas
yes.
even in Aliens and in Alien, these people had big personalities, but it was all within the context of maybe a socioeconomic class, a job that they had to do. You got a sense that there was a functional world that these people were a part of, and their personalities were within that framework. And you never forgot these characters. And another thing about Alien that I think is very fascinating, we'll contrast it with the other big sci-fi film of 1979, but astronauts. You think of 1969, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Those are like NASA astronauts. They work out, they jog in space. There's a lot of downtime, but they're clean cut. They wear the body suits. They look like astronauts in A Space Odyssey. In Star Wars, they're like swashbucklers. They're dressed for adventure and travel. Dude, these guys are wearing like Hawaiian shirts.
Right.
So
literally.
Like Hawaiian, like it's like what a risk that must have been, because that's a conscious choice by whoever's designing the costumes. Like, what? You're gonna wear that? You're supposed to be in space. So whoever the film, Ridley Scott or whoever made that final decision, they chose to depict astronauts as blue-collar workers, almost no different than you'd see on, like you said, Robert, like an oil rig. So you've got a really different look at space. The astronauts, the setting, and also, Star Wars made space fun and adventuresome, and you punch it, Chewie, and you're flying. The opening scene to Alien, there's like this yellow-black mist, and there's this like humming sound. Space is like instantly uncomfortable and scary. Like,
yeah. Well, the advertising, even the trailer was very ominous. You knew something, weird was going to happen. They didn't sell that movie with like, oh, we're going to have fun in space. They did sell it with that like, you can't hear your scream in space.
Yeah, the greatest ad line ever written for any movie.
Yeah.
In space, no one can hear you scream.
Yeah.
I made that a bumper sticker when I was in graphic arts in high school, and they're like, we're going to make bumper stickers. And I had just drawn this really cool picture of a xenomorph. So I made this bumper, this was 1990. I made a bumper sticker that said, in space, no one can hear you scream. That's how transcendent that tagline is. People still, and H.R. Geiger's design of the alien is really legendary art design at this point. But Sigourney Weaver, you hear like Jennifer Lawrence today saying things like, I was the first, female action hero. I'm like, no, you weren't. 1979, you've got Sigourney Weaver, and I love her. I've studied this. She's an emergent heroine, right? She's not even the main character, you wouldn't think.
No.
By watching she kind of like you said, Robert, she's one of the smartest characters, but she's kind of overridden a little bit. She kind of yields to this and then she stops yielding, and she emerges as the only true survivor on this.
Once Captain Dallas is taken out, she's the only one. Yeah. No one else is going to save you. And I think what's really interesting, nobody would ever, like, I never once ever in my life ever heard anybody say anything about the sex or race of characters when I was watching movies as a kid.
Never.
No one would ever, like, nowadays, if Alien had never come out and came out now, be like, oh, there's a girl boss, and no one ever thought that, because the writing of those characters, people understood how to create, like, every one of those characters has over that first scene when they first wake up, and they all start interacting,
so
cool. Who all of those people are.
And Ripley's not even in the opening scene.
Yeah.
No. And when Yaphet Kotto's like, oh, we got to talk about the bonus situation. Yeah, Parker, you'll get whatever's coming to you.
Harry Dean Stanton, man.
And they're having this conversation about money and stuff, and it's what people would talk about, and you're getting to know these characters, and they're so relatable, even though they're on, like you were talking about, Doug, that they're on a spaceship.
Yeah, and they want to go home. They
Right.
want
They
to. They're
and when they're like, we're halfway there, and
yeah.
everyone's like, oh man.
Well, and one thing that stood out watching it semi recently is so they land on this planet. That is the most violent landing I've ever seen. And it's like, even landing a spacecraft on the planet's surface is like dangerous, and it comes with like severe consequences. This one
Yes.
simple act. And, you don't get any of that in a lot of the films today where you have to deal with the consequences of a dangerous environment in the same way. So just because we're running low on time, I just wanted to contrast Alien, which is obviously a super franchise. And it's weird because they keep missing and missing and missing. And because of the strength of the first two films, we will wait until they get this right.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
I will wait
even
until you do it right.
and even their failures, you kind of want to watch it to see like what's going on. How did this happen?
Yeah.
But
So,
I have to duck out. Douglas, thank you so
Paulie.
much.
Yeah, I do too. I've got to go as well.
okay. Well, do you want to say any comment? I know it's got to be brief. Star Trek: The Motion Picture comes out in 1979.
Still my favorite Star Trek movie.
What?
It's fantastic.
It's
Yeah.
my favorite Star Trek
We-
movie.
We got to come back. We need to do a part 2 R&B.
And now that the 4K, they've pretty
Ooh.
much fixed the director's edition fixes a lot of what was wrong.
Was an addiction.
I mean, Star Trek: The Motion Picture was a movie that was deeply compromised because of its production. It was locked into a release date. The movie wasn't finished. They didn't have time to finish it, and so it was released with a number of problems. But and that was indicative of the entire production process of that movie. But I do think it's the closest to the original series.
Yeah, Star Trek: The Motion Picture actually is one of the best Star Trek. Star Trek 2 is my favorite.
Yeah, Star Trek 2 is the best.
Over the years, Star Trek 4 has dropped, and Star Trek 1 has been moving up my list.
Yeah.
Late at night, if I've had a glass of wine, it started as a guilty pleasure movie, and now I just love watching Star Trek: The Motion Picture. There is just so much in that. And, I just wanted to say this. I noticed while watching it kind of recently, Spock leaves the Enterprise at one point to go out to touch V'Ger. He goes out to, and I realized Spock didn't plan on coming back. He basically does in Star Trek 1 what he ends up following through on in Star Trek 2.
Yes.
Where he goes, he's leaving. He's not coming back.
Nope.
Douglas, much love. I'm going to bounce
sorry,
out.
Paul,
Man.
Yeah, I got Doug. I got to go too.
All right, guys, take it easy.
Retro
Thanks for
Nerd Girl,
joining me
great to see
tonight.
you.
Retro and I will
So
wrap
good.
this up.
Yes,
you guys
wrap it up.
Much.
All right, I'll see you later. This was great.
Bye.
Let's do it again.
All right. Thanks for coming on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Oh my God.
And Retro, then there were two.
And then there were two.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. There's so much lore just in a 5-year span in filmmaking, and it is incredible to think of because all these films, and these are 70s movies.
Oh yeah.
Define the 80s and then have this ability to keep going through the 90s and into the 2000s. And there's another Aliens show coming out pretty soon. There's still talk on Star Trek. Superman's coming out in 2 months. So, The Mandalorian and Grogu comes out next year. Star Wars is still producing.
Star Wars is still going, yeah.
So in 1979, there's this glut of films. I was going to talk about Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yes.
The Black Hole comes out in 1979.
Oh yes.
Dracula with Frank Langella.
One of my
Mad
favorites.
Max comes out in 1979. Mad Max is another. They just made, Furiosa, Mad Max Fury Road. These films are still being made. And Mad Max Fury Road was an Oscar winner in 2014 when it came out. So, but its roots, 1979, right in this sweet spot again.
I also want to mention the Muppet movie, which is sort of like the launch to all the Muppet movies that we got over the years. Unfortunately, they don't make them anymore, but we got, we still in our hearts very, very much have kept the Muppets in our hearts. I believe they are over on, they're not they're I'm not sure what channel they are on or if they're still with Disney or where they are, but I know that they're being revived somehow. So
Well, the
I hope
Muppets.
somebody does a movie for the Muppets again.
Well, we actually talked about this briefly through the context of just Jim Henson being one of these baby boomer creatives who
Yes.
just did good with puppets. Oh,
Yeah.
who was good with puppets. So the Muppet movie comes out in 1979, and the Muppets go on to make the Muppets Christmas Carol, which is now
Oh,
a
good.
beloved classic. And you know what's
Yeah.
crazy? I had never seen it. I think I saw it the first time with
Yes.
you at a
Yes.
watch party. I instantly fell in love with that movie and watched it again later that night with my kids. Now my kids love it.
Oh my God, so glad. I'm so
It
glad.
is like a thing now with my kids. They know Marley and Marley.
Yes.
They know the songs, and I'm like, oh my God, this is from this is not from the 70s, but it comes from the Muppets, which started really in the 70s.
Yes.
And the Muppet movie, you're right. I didn't even have that one written down. That's huge. Jim Henson.
Yeah, the Muppet movies, and over the years it just kept on, putting them out along with the other movies that Jim Henson was doing, like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, just,
Mhm.
alongside. And it's just incredible how magical they all are. Any one of them you can watch and you just love it. You just love the Muppets. And they're still a thing. They are still a thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, totally. But again, the seeds were planted in the late 70s and have grown into something that has transcended the 70s and has become part of pop culture in mass. I know Robert Meyer-Burnett mentioned Sesame Street, one of the biggest enculturating shows of all time.
Yeah.
Oscar the Grouch and the Count, Big Bird and Bert and Ernie, like all these everyone knows these characters.
Yes.
So, and they're puppets.
Yeah,
These are
and they've
puppets.
also had a couple of movies too over the years.
Yeah, Muppets Take Manhattan. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff with these puppets. But Jim Henson was also involved, like you said, in his own films, and also didn't he do the design for Yoda? I know Frank Oz did the.
Frank Oz did the voice. There was a person, someone else who did the actual design, and
Okay,
I believe.
Freeborn.
Yes, and he modeled it. He modeled Yoda after himself.
Okay, yeah, I know that the eyes were based off Albert Einstein. The eyes of Yoda are Albert Einstein's eyes. He wanted eyes that could look wise. And trickstery, and he landed on Einstein as someone who could do both.
Yeah. Great there. But the technology that was used for the puppetry is just something now that there a lot of used widely in Hollywood for animatronics and that kind of stuff. So he made a huge contribution to cinema.
Oh
in the
yeah,
70s,
big time.
in the
Big time,
70s
another
and
one of these
80s.
guys. And then, when you look at Star Trek, the motion picture, it comes out in 1979, really on the back or the wave of the Star Wars phenomenon. Suddenly there was this appetite for science fiction. Alien was greenlit like that. The second Star Wars became a commercial success. Star Trek was like kind of wallowing, and then they're like, we need to get this out now. And now Star Trek is a little bit of a hybrid, right? This isn't an invention of the 1970s. Star Trek came from the original series, which was a 60s phenomenon.
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry, also a baby boomer. When was he born? Let me just confirm that. Gene Roddenberry. He's born in 1921, so he's a little bit older. He's not really so that makes sense. So he is not really a part of this baby boomer thing that we're discussing tonight, but he's obviously a creative genius. He came up with the Star Trek concept, and the Star Trek series came out in the 60s. It had 3 seasons, and really meaty, long hour-long episodes, tons of episodes per season. And obviously Star Trek, the original series, set its own trajectory. I mean, the original series still has its own minutia.
Oh, yes.
Um,
It's the iconic stuff which people often look back to see if the modern stuff is, is it really good? Is it as good as the old, Star Trek? And yeah, it provided a certain amount of intellectual conversation around ethics and just all sorts of ideas of what we as human beings may encounter in the future,
well, but
future
also
conversations that we might have.
yeah, the humanity of human beings. Spock wanted. I remember being a little as a kid. I was off put by Spock in this film. He's so unlikable and stiff and rigid and unfriendly to Kirk and Bones, and he was just unlikable in the motion picture. But now, as an adult, when I watch it, I realize that was absolutely intentional, and they're really working on something. They're working
Yes.
through something with the motion picture. Spock, in the original series, that is illogical. It's a famous
Yes.
line that he says. And in the opening scenes of the motion picture, Spock is about to attain Kolinar, which is the total abandonment of human emotion and the total embrace of logic, pure logic. And he the last second breaks up this ceremony and realizes that he's not going to attain Kolinar, which is perfect logic. And instead, he goes out to the Enterprise to reunite with all of his old crewmates, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because if Spock was more likable, this could have been a real magical moment, but it's so oddly anticlimactic because he's like, "Hi, how are you? Can I get started?" And then just walks away, like not friendly. It's so anticlimactic. But
Yeah.
it's because he is attempting to pursue perfect logic. And you realize while watching this, he wants to know, here is an entity, V'ger, that
Yes.
has attained perfect logic. So it's almost like the God of perfect logic is out there now. And he's going to go and he's going to see this God of perfect logic. And the Enterprise is just the vehicle. It's
Yes.
just blind luck that they're passing through, and in the end, Spock realizes it's not enough. It's not enough. And I love the scene. He grabs Kirk's hand and he goes, V'ger, it's beyond his comprehension. He goes, this simple feeling, this feeling of brotherhood when I grab your hand, the way it makes you feel. V'ger has no comprehension of this. It's beyond his ability to understand. And that changes Spock. He begins to see V'ger as a problem and then begins to advise Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise how to defeat it, which I really appreciate. He goes, I love the scene where he's like, V'ger is a child. It's learning. I suggest you treat it. And then so Kirk tries it and then it doesn't go so well. And at some point, Retro, we should analyze it because there are strong elements of the heroine's labyrinth surrounding Lieutenant Ilea.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes. Absolutely.
The real strong stuff around Lieutenant Ilea. In fact, I have the special edition LP, the vinyl record, and it's a picture of her. And with the poisoned apple, she's got the imagery on the neck. It's the sensor on her neck, and she's in an altered state. It has all of this, and I was always perplexed by this imagery of her in the film. When Spock encounters her, she's like the size of a goddess. She's this.
Yes. Oh,
she's
completely like he's a giant.
Yeah, see, it's odd, right? It's an odd choice.
Yes.
So, where are you with Star Trek? Like, was it a big one for you? Was it not a big one?
The Star Trek, I was more endeared to the series than I was to the movies. But the movies was still a good that was something I wanted to see. I always wanted to see the movies.
Right.
The first movie, I'm not sure. When I first saw it, I didn't really get it as much as I get it now. It might have been like the pacing was maybe too slow for me at the time when I saw it, or I just wasn't into it, and I just felt like I had been used to these characters when they were younger, and now they were older. and it looked like it, they were like, they
Yeah.
were, and so I was like, oh, what's happening? So it was like getting to know new characters, and there was so much like, should they still be doing this?
Well,
But
yeah, Kirk in the motion picture, Kirk is no longer a captain, which is weird because he has this problem for almost every film version of Star Trek. He's still not the captain. He's either, how are we going to get him back to be a captain?
yes,
Star Trek 2, there's a training mission and they got to get him back as the captain. Star Trek 3, he has to hijack the ship and now he's the captain. Star Trek 4, they make him captain as the one punishment, So he doesn't become the captain again until Star Trek 5, which came out in 1989.
wow.
But but I guess what I'm trying to say is, although Star Trek itself has roots in the 60s,
Hmm.
there, like you just said, there is a difference. There is a different feel to the movies than the original series.
Yeah,
And the
and
movie version
mhm.
of Star Trek began in 1979.
Now I wanted to also say that during the 70s, one of the reasons why it never really died or never faded away, from pop culture, was that there were reruns, and those
Yes.
reruns would play over and over and again, and I would catch them every time. I love, science fiction, and at some point, some people were like, "Oh yeah, those are Christmas lights, and this is all like really bad, special effects." But you just watched it because there was some sort of intelligence behind each story. Almost was like a Twilight Zone episode in the way it kind of involved your mind, it involved you to think, and that was, I from even as a small child watching this, I was able to get that. And the movies, was sort of the same thing, and like I said, I was maybe it was too, seeing it in 1980, that means I was only 10. I was probably too young to catch all of the references, but later on, yes, after watching, the movie, it was like, "Oh, wow," and I grew to feel like there was a term of endearment, even with Spock being so cold, everyone else seeking his, like, love, if you will.
Oh, and warmth. Yeah, some
Yeah,
warmth
they were
out of
like,
him.
"Okay, like, what's wrong with this picture? Why isn't he more,
Spock,
of a warmer
welcome back.
person?" Yeah, like, a friend, and so, that was kind of interesting to see that develop, by the end, I would, I felt like there was a different thing going on, and definitely the next movie felt like the friendship, the dedication. I mean, you felt that for sure strongly in the second movie, but it was something that they were working on. It feels like in the first movie, and um, it was old friends coming together again.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I'm amazed by it because sometimes I look for what survived. Like the Superman suit and Superman that went all the way to the end, right? And I remember there being a debate recently about the James Gunn. Should Superman wear red underwear on the outside, or
Oh
should they do
yeah,
what Zack Snyder did and remove that and just have it a
mhm,
blue suit straight through? Like, and they chose to go with the blue underwear on the outside,
yeah,
so that's, these things survive. In Star Trek 1, there's a couple of things that survive. One, the most important, the uniforms did not.
yes. So
um,
uniforms.
yeah, those were bizarre, the PJ Starfleet. But the USS Enterprise itself has really become the most iconic version of the Enterprise. It is a beautiful ship. There are times when I'm watching Star Trek 2 or 3, and even at the end of 4 or 5, I'm like, man, what a beautiful looking ship
Oh,
that is. As
yeah,
it's moving through space or coming at you, and
so
but
sleek.
that design, that look, which is the look for the Enterprise,
Mm,
1979 design for the Star Trek Enterprise. Another thing that survived was Spock's Vulcan robe. That he comes in the Enterprise wearing a black
yes.
robe with Vulcan symbols.
Mm,
Becomes a big deal in Star Trek 2 when he's buried in it. And then in Star Trek 3, where that's the proof of life in a sense, or the proof of identity, when they find Spock at a different age. And then, of course, he's wearing he's wearing it in Star Trek 4 briefly, I believe, as well. So the Spock robe becomes a big deal, and that started in this movie. And also the one thing that survived even in the J.J. Abrams reboot, Admiral Kirk's uniform. That uniform survived. It's the white uniform with the gray in the middle. That survives. That look is like the Admiral look in Star Trek. It's like, we've solved it. We're not going to change it. Moving on. They have him, Bruce Greenwood, Commander Pike is wearing it in the J.J. Abrams reboot even. So that look has survived all these years from 1979.
Yeah.
So you had Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And by the way, I just wanted to mention the score. That is another thing that has survived.
Yes.
I think the score, the main title score to Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which is beautiful music, by the way. I love that music. In fact, I love the entire soundtrack of the motion picture. It's one of my all-time favorite soundtracks. I can listen to it from beginning to end anytime. I love it that much. And that score has really come to define, this is the final Star Trek music. And it was written in the late 70s. And that's, it was there in 19. So they kind of moved around a lot with the music in Star Trek. James Horner came in for Star Trek 2 and 3, and then there was Star Trek 4 and 5. But by 5, they came back to Jerry Goldsmith's music. And I think they used it in the Star Trek: The Next Generation. And now when I hear it, it's this music that I hear. So that was a big survivor from Star Trek, the motion picture.
Yeah, the iconic music. You gotta, there has to be, those threads of iconic things that you remember. Star Trek music, the costumes. Those are things that you'll always remember.
Right. So just to bring a little bit of this to a close, I wanted to talk about who was coming into in 1979, some notable people show up in the industry. And they're working on films that technically came out in the 80s, but went into production in 1979. There was like The Shining was one.
Kubrick.
There's a couple of them here. I had a list. But in 1979, they started production on a show called Battle Beyond the Stars, which is gaining a lot of notoriety again. And it was supposed to be it's Roger Corman. It was a low budget, I don't want to say a knockoff, but kind of a knockoff of Star Wars, right? It was supposed to be in that vein.
Yes.
And in 1979, this era, James Cameron shows up. He's working on Battle Beyond the Stars and on the tech side.
Yes.
Gail Ann Hurd, Bill Paxton, John Saylor, and James Horner comes into the picture here. And he wrote the soundtrack to Battle Beyond the Stars, which sounds an awful lot like Star Trek 2.
Well, they reused this song for many different that was used in Battle Beyond the Stars, for even commercials. They were using it for everything because it was so good. So that was one of the recycled things. I actually did a full review on this movie. It's so incredible. But James Cameron in particular, I did want to talk about him because the reason why he was a trucker about the time Star Wars 1977 came out. And he saw that movie and he decided to change his life and go full time, to go for filmmaking. He made the decision to just go for it. And from then on, he only spent a year in school, but it must have been enough for him to learn enough. What he kind of made his way onto the set with on Battle Beyond the Stars, and started out as a lower level technician, and then he just rose to be like the visual effects supervisor. And I was like, wow, that's pretty incredible. And in his job, he pretty much learned a little bit about how to do everything. He learned as he was doing that movie, he learned all the different parts of filmmaking. So when he got the chance to actually make his own movies, he made sure he knew every part, and that was kind of the secret sauce to him winning, later on when he was making his own movies. So I thought that was quite interesting. I saw a behind the scenes of Aliens, and he was like, "Yeah, you've got to look out to, see what can be done because some people will just goof around on the job." He was a toughie when it came to like, people doing their jobs, and he knew all the jobs. So that was his strength as a filmmaker, is to know every single part of it, and his inspiration came from Star Wars, the
Yeah.
movie that really, lit 1970s on fire.
Right. Well, and James Cameron is a baby boomer. He comes from this group of guys and gals that decided to do things differently. And yeah, and like you said, he is very well known for being a stickler in everything. In fact, him and James Horner almost pretty much came to blows
Yes.
when he was trying to score Aliens. He pretty much vowed never to work with James Cameron again, and miraculously they buried the hatchet, and he went on to help him with not only Titanic but also
Mm,
Avatar, two
yes,
other great soundtracks, by the way.
yeah.
And um, and he was not James Horner was nominated for an Academy Award for his score for Aliens, and it is a great score. That's another one.
Oh, yes,
I love it.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's on my top, 5, I would say.
But yeah, and I think it's worth noting, James Cameron, came up through the 70s, but so did Gail Ann Hurd, who would
Yes.
go on to become one of the greatest producers of all time,
Mhm.
involved in so many shows. I think she's still involved with like The Walking Dead. Um, but she got her start in the late 70s. There was Battle Beyond the Stars, Humanoids in the Deep, and obviously Terminator.
Yes.
She would be involved with, and Aliens. So another big standout coming from this group of visionaries, and I dare say some geniuses at work at redefining this industry, but
Mhm.
also it's indicative of the culture change, I think, at large that was
Yeah.
going on.
Yes, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about ILM, which, was
Oh yeah,
developed, around this time, and just these guys, at one point, they had people working for them that created Photoshop. They they had CGI in the
yep,
90s. They were just really responsible for changing, the scope of the special effects and making them more realistic, more and more realistic, and they're still working on that today. I would say that a lot of the stuff that they produce is really good as far as the visual aspect. Um, I think they've managed to figure out and change the industry because now so many other companies are doing exactly what they're doing. It was actually um, something that they began and started to monopolize, and now a lot of people know how to do this. But one thing I also wanted to say, a lot of the people who were watching this, or who were creating ILM or working for ILM, and George Lucas and Spielberg, these guys were watching people like Ray Harryhausen,
yes,
who was
oh
like,
yeah,
for his stop motion and creative special effects in that department. They didn't look perfect, but it had an imagination that reached out and spoke to your soul, basically,
yes,
because it was so different and unusual, and they broke new ground, if you will, by going with their fantasy instincts, like, okay, this scene is so crazy, let's just see what it would look like if we tried. And they did everything in their power to do that. Like that trench scene in Star Wars is just miraculous, and they did that, making a miniature of the trench run and going through so many different iterations of that until they landed the plane on it. It was just great.
Yeah. Well, it was like, and we should probably do a separate show on this at one point. Now that we've defined the 1975 to 1979 like era, these guys were mostly inspired by a ton of films from the 50s,
Yes.
which we should
All
dig into those films just as its own topic one of these days. But it was
Mhm.
almost like they saw these films from the 50s that captured their imagination, but lacked the practical effects to be completely convincing, right?
Yes, yes,
It was like good enough to get your imagination just in the
yes,
grip of the film. And yet you knew you were watching a film on some level. And they
yes,
were like,
yes.
I think I could do that again and convince you it's completely real. And these guys, I think Robert Meyer-Burnett mentioned it, in 1977, these people were living in like a garage and building the Death Star
Yes.
and sleeping overnight and drinking tabs and eating Doritos. And just, I mean, it was not a glamorous thing. This was like a camp out in a parking lot where these guys were just hard at work, working probably not at full price in order to get all these effects done because they were that driven by the vision they had to put this out there because they were convinced they could make it real. They were
Yes.
convinced they could do it. And even like we talked about on one of your streams, the stunts, the guy, Yaphet, not Yaphet Kota, the stunt man, it's going to kill me. I'm messing up. He's got a
Canute.
yeah. They saw him perform that stunt in Stagecoach and on The Mask of Zorro.
Yes.
So he's like, I think we could do it with, in the 1940s on one of those Nazi troop carrier trucks.
So good.
All these things that they saw as boys that made them fill with wonder, they were almost pathologically driven to try to recreate it with practical effects using technology that they themselves had to invent.
Yes, yes, and we cannot, not say anything about Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers.
Yep.
So, and just as a background for everybody to know, they weren't around when those serials were out that you could go to the theater and see them. But in the 50s, they did play them on television.
Right.
And so they were able to watch these incredible shows on television of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. These guys are from the future, and it's so great. Like they were able to get that, that insert of imagination, low end special effects, and just get that fantasy element and just trying to figure out, okay, how can I do this just as good or better? How can I tell stories that make sense with these kind of this kind of fantasy?
Well, and guess what went into production in 1979 as well? Flash Gordon went into production in 1979. It comes out in 1980, but it went into production in this era, 1979. And it's
With
probably
Dina
worth noting
De Laurentiis as the producer.
Yeah, Max von Sydow as Ming the Merciless, Sam Jones as Flash Gordon. I mean, what a fun campy. It has recently come out in 4K. And I was blown away by how good it looked. It's sometimes they do 4K and it doesn't work. Sometimes they do it and it just dominates. The colors.
Oh yeah.
Of Flash Gordon in 4K, like in Ming the Merciless's court when he's like, "People of Ardensia."
Yes.
That scene is incredible. The colors in it and the crispness.
Oh wow.
Max von Sydow and the hypnotic ring, which is a poisoned apple, by the way. And think of who he uses it on Dale. So anyway, it's just amazing stuff. And Star Wars was actually, Lucas wanted to remake Flash Gordon.
Yes.
And he was denied. So he basically created his own Flash Gordon, which became Luke Skywalker, which became Star Wars, which became its own thing. Yes. So it's interesting that the original Flash Gordon decided to try to jump on board. And
a little late.
And the practical effects are nowhere near what Lucas accomplished with A New Hope.
Yeah, I mean, Dino De Laurentiis is a very interesting character all through the 70s, although the movies that he did, but it really was like, when you're stepping into the arena of fantasy sci-fi, I think everybody, when we see Flash Gordon, we understand what the effort there was, to do it. Even if the special effects doesn't make it, I'm looking at for that 4K version that you're talking about, because 'cause I'm like, yes, it needed a little refining, a little fine-tuning. It's a wonderful display of that genre of fantasy sci-fi that, that we've always wanted. I feel like, society's always been, connected to fantasy and sci-fi. So,
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, Lucas and those guys, they made it look real. When ships were flying through space, it
Yeah.
looked real. They looked fast. Like
Oh,
he captured that, and that was not really achieved before. And also that lived in universe. You go to Buckrock, everything's like chrome and
yes.
shiny and
Yeah.
new. And he's like, no, 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 no. It would all be worn down and oily and oil trails and lived in and cast aside. And
Yeah.
that
When
Star
you're when you're in Tatooine, you are immersed in this world that looks like it's just been like dust storms, and it just feels so realistic. And then you've got scenes where you've got the rebels coming in to launch their trench run, and that scene alone is so breathtaking. As you look at these ships,
Yeah.
they have color on it. It's a colorful moment, but it's also these ships have seen battle.
Yes.
This looks like a real universe. What am I looking at? This is real.
Right.
And that's the thing I believe sold everyone on Star Wars, because if it was a chrome finish, as maybe I think that might have been some of the things I didn't like about the prequels, was it felt like everything was too shiny and
Right.
perfect, whereas those movies just felt, you can feel the texture of that makes it feel so real. And
Right.
the work that was done, just to make it look so very much, like it was a realistic thing that happened, along with a fantastic story, along with great editing, boom,
Yeah, in
you got
fact, when
Star
I was
Wars.
watching the sequel trilogies and I saw Captain Phasma for the first time, I was like, oh man, that's like the exact opposite of what George Lucas was going for. He doesn't want the chrome stormtroopers, the Black Hole, which also comes out in this year,
Oh,
1979,
yes,
the Black Hole.
yes.
This is the movie that made me understand what George Lucas was talking about. You have all these bots, they have those two laser things they walk
Yes.
around with. They are like shiny and chrome, and the lasers sound different. And I remember thinking when watching this, I was like, that's what George Lucas was trying to solve. He doesn't want that there's something so artificial and unbelievable about the chrome
Yes.
future that he decided to go the exact other route with it. And that paid off. So by the time you get to the sequel trilogies, we're in 2014, 2015. They're going back to the Chrome Troopers again with Captain Phasma. And I was,
Yeah.
I think because it was Gwendolyn Christie, we give it a pass.
Oh, yeah.
But technically, that's not the look that he wanted for the Star Wars universe. So I'm a little bit more forgiving of the prequels, but you are correct technically that defies the lived-in universe approach. But I think the prequels, what it did was create an entire world of high society, right? The high, it's a beautiful, flourishing galactic civilization, and
Yes.
this is the capital, and so
And I think that was the point, right?
right.
This is, what, 30 years earlier or something like that, and the world, it was just the universe or the galaxy was a different place, you know?
But I think it's more compelling, personally, to watch a story about a kid from the fringes of space in the lived-in universe rather than watching the elites of the Jedi Order and the
Hmm.
Galactic Senate, have debate. it's harder for some reason for us to connect to those
Yeah,
characters
it was.
than it is to a farm boy on
Yeah.
Tatooine, because it's easier to identify with that. You know,
Yeah.
like you said, alien, truckers in space, blue collar, farm boy. You know, it's these are working class heroes. And when we got to the elites, it was like, okay, I think we like them. Like I love Obi-Wan Kenobi in the prequels.
Oh yeah.
Mace Windu in the prequels. I like Qui-Gon Jinn. Like I like a lot of the characters, but it was a different world. It was a different feel by the time we got to the prequels. And I was even making the case earlier. Andor has really created a new look for Star Wars because it's not the lived-in universe of the original series. It's not the perfectly polished, over-the-top, high government of the prequels.
Mhm.
This is a cosmopolitan empire in Andor.
Yes.
And it is it has democratic institutions still, like the Senate, and yet there's this democratic authoritarianism from the bureaucracy. And then while this is happening, you have the rebels forming on these other planets that also have good planets, but that are in the process of deteriorating. They're moving from beautiful to less beautiful to battle scarred to wounded to destroyed. So Andor has actually created a third real universe for the Star Wars world, or the Star Wars universe. The lived in cosmopolitan empire, and then the high society of the prequels.
And I wonder if the Obi-Wan series could have taken a couple of notes from Andor, but that's in hindsight because one was done before the other.
But it set it in Tatooine, which is your lived-in universe again. So we should probably avoid the Kenobi discussion. There's so many things. But anyway, just to wrap up the basic idea here of 1975 to 1979. All these films came out in this period, and these films really did go on to really make a mark in the 1980s, to become super franchises. And I was Gen X, I was a kid, so I was a fan of these, and the fandom. They get a bad rap today, and maybe some of it's deserved, but a lot of it is not. The fans did something special in the 80s and in the late 70s. We supported these films. We created. It wasn't just a 2-hour movie. Like when you think of like Cleopatra.
Ooh,
It's a great film. It's a classic. It's iconic. Elizabeth Taylor in that role, but that's where it starts and ends in that 2-hour or almost 3-hour frame. It lives and breathes inside that space of a movie. By the time you get to my generation, Star Wars now is a video game. It's a board game. There's a Monopoly version of Star Wars. There's pillowcases, wallpaper. There's action figures. There's soundtracks, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. And now you've got sequels, and then you've got another sequel. Now there's the trilogy, and now there's the special editions, and now there's a spoof, and now there's another spoof on this thing, and now there's Spaceballs. Mel Brooks is going to get involved. It goes in all these directions and becomes so much more than that 2-hour film that we remember from some, great movies too. Gone with the Wind, like I said, Cleopatra, The Graduate. These are great movies, but they kind of only are movies.
Yes, the most you could do is maybe remake, but there hasn't been an effort to make a sequel or to I mean, this is I think with the arrival of Jaws and Star Wars, those are the two big ones, but Jaws in particular was like, okay, there's a second movie, should you go out to see that? And and sure enough, it wasn't gonna be better. You knew that. And then there was like The Omen. There was like so many movies of The Omen, and even remakes. Dracula is like a constant one. And also there's The Exorcist. We had Exorcist 2 and I believe 3. I kind of like
Superman 2.
Exorcist.
Well, around this time, there was still a stigma to sequels.
Yeah.
It was viewed as kind of anti-artistic and a cash grab and cheap and corporate. And you didn't make movies to make sequels. Well, the late 70s, well, you did have the Dirty Harry, you had some sequels, but they were more like the Outlaw Josie Wales, then you had like Dirty Harry. So they were kind of like, they were sequels, but they didn't put the number 2.
Yeah, it was set in the same universe, but not necessarily a part of. I mean, they were part of the same franchise, but it wasn't
Kind of like
listed as like a
Ballerina.
same. Yeah.
Ballerina's like part of the John Wick universe.
Yeah.
It was more like that, right?
Yeah.
Well, this era, they start to shake that stigma. They're like, no, we're making Superman 2. We're going to make Star Wars 2. We're going to make Aliens 2 or
Even
Alien 2.
Do you remember Piranha?
James
Piranha 2?
Cameron worked on Piranha 2.
Yes, and they fly now, basically, is what that movie was all about.
Yeah, what a unexpected beginning for him. It's like the one out of all the stuff he did, which is so great. It's like that. It's like Piranha 2?
Piranha 2? Okay.
He also, I found out in 1978, he did write and produce an entire film, some like indie film. What was it? James Cameron, 1970.
Exogenesis.
That's it. That's totally it.
Very, very creative, very experimental. This is an experimental movie. And it kind of feels like Terminator meets like some sort of Romeo and Juliet story in space, like really creative stuff. And it's a short, basically. It's not a full feature film. Very good. And that is the type of creativity that I think all of these kind of guys started out with. It seems like a pure love to be in the business and try out new stuff, like the Dark Star, like THX 138, I believe. That is the George Lucas movie.
That was much more experimental.
Excellent movie.
Right,
Excellent
totally.
movie. It is definitely one of those things where they experimented first and they learned a lot and they applied that to these blockbusters. So, there is something like, that your first movie doesn't have to be like the best movie. That's why I kind of give directors and filmmakers just a pass if it's like, okay, they sometimes didn't always hit the ball out of the ballpark, but at least give them a chance because this is a learning experience for them the next time.
Well, and that's one of the differences between the modern era. Bad movies were still attempts to be good movies. Whereas today I feel like they're like, we don't care if it's good. We're just going to tell you something. We have a preset idea with a preset morale, and we're gonna make this movie into this ideologically conforming thing. And so it's not even bad art. It's just like it feels more propagandistic, like Star Trek V. That is not a great film. But when I watch it, I can appreciate that they were trying to make a good film. Today, I don't feel that love in the film, even the ones that aren't good from the 80s, like even Predator 2. I realize I love Predator 2. I've gone back and I've seen all these older movies that I thought I didn't like. Robert Meyer-Burnett mentioned Star Trek 1. Now I love Star Trek 1.
That was
Star Trek 3.
That was one I said, I didn't quite understand it when I was little. Maybe I was too young, but now I'm like, oh, that's so, it's a great movie. And again, I feel the sentimental part of it with, the old crew is coming back together again.
Right.
I didn't understand that at 10,
Well, whoops, I didn't mean to hit that.
This is an interesting layout.
Like total accident. Do you have any like closing thoughts or final thoughts about what we've been talking about, generational realities? What was happening in the world for baby boomers and the geopolitical world that they were in, what it meant to make a shift before and after the Vietnam War, the changes in art style. We talked about the relationship between the boomers and the Xers, who ate this stuff up. We love this stuff.
Yes.
And Xers have gone on to create, that were inspired by this, John Favreau, the Russo brothers, Taylor Sheridan. There's some big James Gunn is an Xer. The Russo brothers, Chris Nolan is an Xer. Seth MacFarlane, Trey Parker, Matt Stone. Now our generation has come up and delivered some things as well. But I know what we were inspired by. We were inspired by these guys, and I think that these years in particular, 1975 to 1979. Were absolutely formative. They were the ones that planted the seeds, and so much more has grown out of it than just a bunch of films that happened to come out of the 70s.
Oh, yes. I mean, I agree 100%. This is when I think about my childhood and the movies that really inspired me. There were the gritty ones, too. You got like Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon. My mom actually took me to the movies to see this. Looking for Mr. Goodbar. These were terrifying movies when you think about it, but also when you get to Star Wars and you get to Jaws, where it was a kids event too. Like, oh, we're all gonna go out to see this, and we're gonna see it multiple times, and we're gonna get all the material. We're gonna get the books, and we're gonna get whatever we could. My mom wasn't that rich, but we got a couple of items, and it just made you feel so good to be a part of this pop culture happening. We went to see Aliens in the movies, and it was terrifying. I was scared, but it was also like, what a great monster. What a great story.
Yes.
And never forgot it when Aliens came out in 86. We had to go see that movie.
Oh,
Because we had to. We were like, "Oh my god, this looks like it's gonna be so good." And it was fantastic. It was at that time, I thought it was the best movie ever made. I was like, "This is fantastic." And there's something about the influence of the 70s, and it feels like in the first 2 years or 3 years of the 80s, we still had that influence, right? Because like you were mentioning, there are like developing movies in the 70s with the same
Shining,
idea.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Empire Strikes Back went into
Empire-
production in 1979.
yeah.
Flash
So-
Gordon went into production in Battle Beyond the Stars went into production. And there's probably others that I'm not even thinking about, but so 1980. So even films in the 1980s actually had their roots in 1979 because they were filming them in 1979. In fact, it was weird. I was watching a documentary on the making of Empire Strikes Back, and I was looking, and they had a photograph of like the schedule, or the production schedule, and it had like October 12th, something 1979. I was like, 1979.
Yeah,
and it just changed something in my head. I was like, oh my God, they're in the 70s still when they're making Empire Strikes Back. All those sets and all those black and white photos of Han Solo and the set on Cloud City, 1979.
Yeah, I remember in New York City, 1970, not the prettiest place to be at all times. Like it was kind of gritty and grungy, and it was I remember Ed Koch became mayor and cleaned up the entire, the neighborhood. So, and then when you have all the influences of Vietnam, the aftermath, a lot of those guys, when they came back, they got very little support, and many of them committed suicide. And it was pretty awful how they were treated. And in the aftermath, a lot of families were also in trouble as well. I mean, that's a family nucleus, right? So it wasn't the easiest time in the 70s and early 80s, but with the onset of these franchises, they really gave you a sense of hope. Even the ones that were horror based, they gave you a sense of like, okay, let's all get together and go to the movies and see these these iconic things. We never shut up about it. The
Yeah.
Gen Xers, we never shut up. That's why they had to go back and redo all the 80s movies, because we wouldn't stop talking about the 80s movies too. So that I think it's the boomers started it, but I think the Generation X really was and still is the generation of fandom and um and pop culture preservation.
They
We really went for it as far as making sure everybody knew that we all the stories we loved.
Well, they actually conducted studies in terms of merchandising and marketing, and they
Hmm.
found out that the best way to get products out is to market them to Gen X, because they
Ooh,
said Generation X is one of the most influential generations because they know pop culture, they know things, and they also have good relation. They know how to talk to millennials, just like they know how they can also talk to boomers. So if Gen X likes it, they tend to get millennials like, hey, what's FOMO? What's going
yes,
on?
yes.
I want in. They can get boomers to get like make it interesting to boomer. So they say that Gen X is actually an extremely quiet. They're
Mm,
quiet. They're not like consider. I think Gen X or baby boomers are considered a little. They have a little bit of confrontational, in your face style.
yeah, yeah.
Millennials have a very emoting. They have their own thing. But Gen X, we tend to be a little bit more quiet and less attention grabbing, if you will.
Mhm.
And of course, this doesn't apply to every single Gen Xer. There are a wide spectrum of personalities, but
Yes.
in general, Gen Xers tend to be quiet but extremely influential. And we're the ones that that grabbed the hold of this pop culture. So we loved it, and so the
Yes.
world loved it. And we have, like you said, we have not stopped talking about it. We're here tonight because of it. And if you want your movie to succeed, aim it
Gen
toward
X.
Gen X. We will take that torch. We will take that flag and run with it. And we will not stop.
Yes, yes.
So, well, that about does it for us tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. I know that I enjoyed it. It was great having Paulie from Latino Slant on, and Robert Meyer-Burnett
Oh, that's
and Retro
awesome.
Nerd Girl. It was such a wonderful crew tonight. I think we had a lot of different perspectives coming in from it, and I think we covered a lot of ground. And I will look to expand on this conversation one way or another, because there is a lot here, and there's a lot to talk about with pop culture at this level, and looking for angles on these things. So that's it for me. And unless did you want to tell everyone one more time where they could find you?
Oh, yes, you can find me on YouTube and on X. It's Retro Nerd Girl. And, stop by and see if there are any videos or live streams you might want to hang out with me on.
Or watch parties.
Or
Retro Nerd
watch parties,
Girl
yes.
will host watch parties where you can watch a
Every
movie with her.
Saturday.
Every Saturday, you can watch a movie with her live and discuss it as the movie plays. So, and then for me, you're obviously here. You know where you could find me. And that's it for us tonight. May the force be with you guys.
Bye.
Good night.